Crash Valheim was considered the failed son of a renowned family of swordsmen. However, he was born without any talent for the sword. Instead of receiving a blessing, he came into the world bearing the curse of an evil god. With his black cloak, he could take the curses of anyone upon himself. However, he ended up being used by that world's hero, a regressor, as a vessel to absorb every terrible curse they encountered along the way. By the end of his life, Crash was frail and could barely move without feeling sick. After enduring all of that, he was simply discarded. Arthur, the hero, then decided to regress for another attempt, sharing the memories of that life only with the girls from his precious harem. What he never imagined was that Crash would have the courage to steal his ability at the very last moment, and with that Arthur ceased to exist. He met his end in that devastated reality, and shortly afterward returned to the past. Now it would fall to Crash to save that world, taking on the mission while stealing every ability he could. Want to find out how this story continues? VT editor on the battlefield already covered with the Fallen, that supposed good-for-nothing seemed to be doing absolutely nothing. A female warrior immediately ordered that man to remove the curse afflicting Lord Arthur. Despite being wounded and feeling that he had reached his limit, the sorcerer declared that he would absorb the curse. His name was Crash Valheim. Considered a failure despite being born into the most powerful bloodline, Crash possessed a strange gift, with hands emerging from his palms, strongly resembling Didara's power. He activated the Black Cloak ability. A hand made of shadows emerged and drew out every trace of the curse within Arthur's body. That was his gift. Crash could steal curses. While the heroes fought the invasion threatening to destroy the world, Crash belonged to the Great Heroes Party, regarded as the #1 of the Asura generation. At that moment, he dropped to his knees, weakened and sick. However, none of the girls seemed to care about him, as all their concern was focused entirely on Arthur. Meanwhile, Crash watched that world approach its end. A creature resembling a horseman of the apocalypse advanced, destroying everything in its path. A rain of meteors devastated everything around them. Arthur no longer believed there was any point in fighting it. Facing a blue knight of Eden with so few people simply did not seem possible. Arthur then released his sword and decided to abandon the battle. Afterward, he embraced the 3 girls who remained beside him. Unable to understand his actions, Crash asked what the hell Arthur was doing. Arthur replied that he was ending everything. The world had practically vanished, and at that point, only destruction remained. Crash could not believe Arthur was truly giving up at that moment. After all, he was supposed to save those people. He was also supposed to honor the sacrifice of everyone who had fallen throughout that journey. Apparently, spending so much time surrounded only by women had made Arthur completely lose his mind. However, Sigram Ephania, the 3rd princess of the Ephania Empire, ordered Crash to be silent. In her eyes, someone who merely stole curses had no right to speak that way. Crash replied that, coming from her, those words could certainly be considered a compliment. Even so, the women continued defending Arthur and calling him their savior, yet none of them would have made it that far without Crash's help. So he decided to remind them of the past, starting with Bella. The Red Witch of the Magic Tower, a member of the Asura generation, had lost the ability to use magic without relying on her own voice. Suffering from that condition, she had begged Crash countless times to remove her curse. Even so, she eventually turned against him when Crash went to get the medicine. Back then, just like now, her arrogant attitude remained exactly the same. Next came Mary Diana, a knight of the Ephania Empire and a member of the Asura generation. She was known as the most powerful spear wielder in the Empire, but also as a complete blockhead. After being afflicted by several curses, she cried and begged Crash to remove them. And then there was the princess, who now called the very man who had saved her trash, even though he had sacrificed his own sight for her. Crash asked whether she finally understood everything he had endured to help them, despite being persecuted by that princess during their academy days. She tormented him constantly. Back then, Crash was seen as a failure and could barely defend himself. He simply endured the humiliation while everyone else stood around mocking him. Before her curse was removed, she had been unbearable. Throughout all that time, Crash had dealt with every problem they left behind. And this was what he received in return. From anyone else, he might have accepted it. But from them, he no longer expected anything at all. Arthur had the power to save that world. He had given Crash hope and could have led all those idiots to the very end. Crash served him believing that together they could save the world. Yet just when they were so close to the end, Arthur decided to give up. Arthur then revealed the truth. To him, that world was already lost, so he intended to simply start everything over again. It was not the first time Arthur had witnessed the end of the world, as his ability allowed him to regress and transfer memories. That way, everyone could start again with all the experience they had accumulated. Crash finally understood. With that, their chances of preventing the world's destruction on the next attempt would be much greater. Arthur confirmed it and explained that he would begin by taking the girls with him. Crash, however, would be left behind because he was not considered necessary. His unique ability truly could steal curses that were nearly impossible to break. However, after so many curses had destroyed his body, there was no reason to restore his memories after regressing through time. To Arthur, he could simply use Crash again. Once again, the naive Crash realized that everything had been planned from the very beginning. Perhaps they had already done exactly the same thing to him in some previous life. Arthur then departed with his girls toward the next regression, all so that he could try to save the world once again. Crash knew that if Arthur had truly considered him him a real companion, he never would have remained beside the blue generation while everyone continued ignoring Crash's very existence. Right after stealing that final curse, he collapsed weakened to the ground and no longer had the strength to pursue the hero. His consciousness began to fade along with his strength. Even so, he refused to accept that everything would end that way. His ability, Shadow Cloak, did not only steal curses, it could also take abilities. He had never tried it on Arthur because he knew his powers were extremely difficult to steal. However, now that he was about to die, he had nothing left to lose. While Arthur used his regression, he was enveloped by the black hand created by the power of Crash's cloak. However, shortly afterward, that hand dissolved. Arthur then asked if he still had not given up. Crash replied that he had witnessed countless destructions and that the previous time he had left behind a worn-out version of himself. Just as he had then, he repeated this countless times in worlds nearing destruction. He asked how many times Arthur had endured that despair, but declared that this time he would be the one left behind. Arthur replied that Crash was acting like an idiot without any rationality. Crash merely smiled and admitted that perhaps he really had lost his mind a little. At that moment, the Blue Knight of Eden was already prepared to finish them both before Arthur could act. Before they could complete the regression, the blast swept away everything in its path. However, the one who actually managed to return to the past was Crash, now in a much smaller form. Despite his youthful appearance, he was not a child, he was simply short and was actually already 15 years old. World erosion occurs when one world begins invading another, creating erosion zones. When this phenomenon occurs, various changes begin to emerge. The environment also undergoes changes, while species originating from the erosion begin invading those other worlds. Among these creatures, those that are intelligent and resemble humans are known as world invaders. Ordinary people have no chance against such powerful creatures. However, there are those who directly confront world erosion. They are known as the heroes of the Asura generation, while Crash was merely someone who could steal and seal curses. He joined the Asura generation but ended up being treated merely as a vessel for those curses, betrayed and condemned to a miserable existence. Now, however, he had returned and awakened once again in his old room at his family's residence. Moments earlier, it had been the height of winter, and he had been on the verge of dying on that battlefield. Now it was summer, and the heat against his skin was already enough to make him sweat. He realized that he truly was in Blue Pine Hall, the place where he had lived during his childhood. That meant his final gamble, attempting to steal Arthur's ability, had actually succeeded. He had returned to the past, although he still did not understand how he had managed to steal that ability. Many believed that Black Cloak was an ability that could be used freely without any limitations. However, it had an obvious flaw. The cloak could only steal something belonging to the target when the user unlocked the lock created after activating the ability. The difficulty of that lock was determined by the affinity the owner had with that specific object. Even a simple stone found on the street became harder to steal if its owner considered it valuable. Naturally, a unique ability possessed enormous value, making the difficulty of stealing it astronomical. The greater its value and the more complex its conditions, the harder it would be to take. Crash also had no idea what Arthur was thinking. However, when he activated his power, no lock appeared, indicating that Arthur truly wanted to abandon that ability. It was surprising to imagine that the man known as the King of Heroes finally wanted to stop regressing through time. Crash remembered several occasions when Arthur had revealed an expression of profound exhaustion. It was as though he had simply completed yet another task, saving another world destined for destruction. After repeating that so many times, Arthur had probably reached his limit. To him, that ability had become a genuine curse he desperately wanted to escape. Because of that, he tried to ensure that the others retained their memories, while Crash would end up being excluded from everything. However, because Crash stole Arthur's ability, he was the one who ended up being left behind, and he ended up being struck by the meteor launched by the Blue Death Knight. Crash had taken the very ability Arthur wanted so badly to be free of. He hoped Arthur was satisfied now. Arthur had always looked down on him, as though stealing curses were a simple task that anyone could accomplish. He never noticed the suffering of the companion who remained in the shadows. To Crash, Arthur had merely received the consequences of his own choices. Walking through the corridor of the Blue Pine Mansion, Crash looked at himself in the mirror and realized how small he was. He looked 10 years old, with a short stature and subtly developed muscles. That was the result of training with the sword every day to survive among the Valheim, considered the most powerful martial family in the kingdom of Starlon. If he had returned to that exact period of his life, then the Valheim trial ceremony must have already taken place. During it, each member revealed and demonstrated the ability they had received. That ability came from the god with whom the person established a contract. The better the contractor, the higher that god's rank would be. The direct Valheim bloodline had always received great blessings, but Crash was the exception. Without talent or distinction, he had not been chosen by any god. After that result, he ended up being expelled from the main residence. He was then sent to the Blue Pine Mansion, the destination reserved for members considered failures. However, at that moment, only Crash knew that the end of that world was approaching. It would be an apocalypse that not even the Asura generation could prevent. Then, who could possibly do anything about it? Crash decided that he would prevent that world's destruction. As he reflected on this, he realized that it did not matter whether he was capable of doing it or not. He had to prevent the disaster because if that world ended, his life would end with it. Therefore, there was no other choice. On the way, he encountered Ariad, the only butler in that mansion. Considering all the work piled up, it almost seemed like exploitation. Crash then approached Ariad with a calm smile on his face, remembering that this butler had taken care of him when everyone considered him a failure, but asked when Ariad intended to use the poison given to him by Crash's brother to end his life. After all, that same butler had poisoned him when he was 14 years old, making Crash experience the first great betrayal of his life. Meanwhile, a young swordswoman only 15 years old faced and defeated several knights without any assistance. Everyone around her was impressed by the skill demonstrated by Charlotte Valheim. She was Crash's older sister and, naturally, was considered the greatest hope of the entire family at that time. They said she was a talent who appeared only once every 1,000 years. For that reason, the family lord placed great hopes in her, a true genius who would prevent the bloodline from dying out. However, Belican Valheim, Crash's half-brother, was far from pleased when he heard that. His goal was to eliminate that entire bloodline, but Charlotte represented a massive obstacle to his plans. Her mother also possessed considerable talent. In the end, only that useless failure remained. That was why he ordered Ariad to get rid of Crash. Just one drop of that poison, and he would never have to worry about money or his daughter's treatment again. The problem was that Ariad had always cared for the young master as though he were his own son. Belokin, however, asked whether he would truly choose someone else's son over his own daughter. Naturally, Ariad would never do that. That was precisely why he ultimately accepted the mission. Before the regression, the day Ariad was supposed to act against him also ended up being the day of Ariad's own death. Unable to endure the guilt of accepting that task, Ariad ended up eating the poisoned steak himself. In the present, when Crash questioned the butler, Ariad naturally pretended to know nothing. Crash, however, immediately realized that he was merely feigning ignorance. Despite having considered harming him for his own daughter's sake, Ariad truly believed Crash would never find out. The young man said there was no problem if he wished to keep pretending. After all, if he had not been considered a failure from the very beginning, that order would never have been given. Ariad was confused. He expected Crash to cry in anger or show outrage over the betrayal, but the boy reacted with unexpected maturity. He seemed to have changed completely. Crash then led Ariad to the library. Without any warning, he asked the butler to cut through the wall beside the fireplace. For someone who served as the Valheim family's butler, such a task was extremely simple. With a single strike from his sword technique, Ariad opened the wall. Not even the butler knew about the secret passage hidden there, while Crash entered it with the ease of someone who already knew exactly where it was. It was as though Crash had known that path all his life. Ariad then realized just how profoundly the young man had changed. Meanwhile, Crash stared at the massive locked gate at the end of the secret corridor, and the sight immediately stirred a memory. Old memories returned. Previously, everything in that place had been consumed by flames, but this time he had arrived before that could happen. Ariad offered to break the chains around the lock, but Crash said he would not be able to do it. He then decided to personally test his strength using the black cloak. The shadows seeped inside the lock and shattered it from within. Crash did not even try to conceal that power, causing Ariad to wonder whether the young man had formed a contract with a god. Only then did Crash realize the mistake he had made. At that point in time, he should not have formed that contract yet. To cover his mistake, he confirmed that he had made a contract, but only with an insignificant god. As for the library, Ariad could tell his father everything if he wished. Ariad knew that until the previous day, young Master Crash's eyes had looked like those of someone who had already lost all desire to keep going. Yet everything seemed different after that divine contract. Ariad concluded that Crash had probably received some powerful ability. Furthermore, he carried the same bloodline as the greatest genius in that family. He might never reach Charlotte's level, but he still had the potential to surpass his own limits. Because of that, Ariad promised to keep the matter secret and tell the Lord nothing. Crash found that decision strange, but realized it was probably an indirect consequence of his regression. By acting differently from the past, Crash was already beginning to alter history. If he could cure Ariad's daughter, perhaps he could secure the butler's loyalty for good. As long as he remained at the Blue Pine Manor, he could use the opportunity to increase the number of allies on his side. He then told the butler to act as he saw fit, while planning to take care of his daughter later. After that, Crash headed toward the estate's secret library. The moment the doors opened, the two were greeted by an intense beam of light. It was surprising that even Crash, someone who had endured countless curses, could feel a chill at the sight before him. That brilliant glow came directly from one particular book. It was exactly the object Crash had been searching for. The secret library of the Green Pine Manor held techniques and memories left behind by ancestors who had been regarded as failures of the Valheim family. These were not abilities, but the fruits of human effort. Secret books created by those who sought to reach the pinnacle despite being considered failures were stored there. Originally, any family member could enter that place, but everything changed, and the library was eventually hidden because of a single person. His name was Damaris Valheim, known as the worst failure in the history of that family. Even so, he eventually became one of the most powerful after being consumed by the world's erosion. And now the secret book belonging to the worst of all failures stood directly before Crash. At the height of his power, Damaris could overwhelm warriors who considered themselves exceptionally strong in mere moments. Almost no one could stop him. His secret involved what was known as the extreme blood immersion poison. Damaris incorporated this poison to enhance his strength and developed an extraordinary secret art capable of controlling such immense power. Holding the book, Crash remembered that half of it had previously been destroyed. Because of that, he still did not know the true reason Damaris had met such a fate. As far as he knew, Damaris had lost his sanity because he could not control the progression of the erosion within his own body. When Crash was afflicted by the world's erosion curse, he managed to weaken it with the power of the Black Hood and endure its effects despite the immense suffering. Perhaps the same principle could work against the damage caused by the extreme blood immersion poison. If that poison circulated through his blood and Crash obtained a curse capable of controlling its progression, he might be able to master its effects. In that way, he could attain strength similar to Damaris while avoiding the severe consequences Damaris had suffered. After reaching that conclusion, Crash ordered Ariad to make sure no one else gained access to the place. No one was to enter the Blue Pine Manor again. That was a direct order. After leaving, Ariad began to think that the young master might be willing to overlook his mistake. Determined to repay that kindness, Ariad decided to reject Belokin's proposal and remain loyal to his master, Crash. When Belokin learned about it, as expected, he lost his temper. The family's genius, and that failure infuriated him, especially since he already carried so many insecurities. He knew that without that woman's bloodline standing in his way, both Lilith and he would have retained their positions in the direct lineage. Belokin summoned the butler and ordered him to investigate the Blue Pine Mansion. He wanted to know why that damned butler had changed his mind. However, the butler explained that entering the place was impossible. Ariad, the household's chief butler, had barred everyone from entering. Not even the head of the family was allowed inside. Belokin found it absurd. That failure was becoming far too arrogant. Meanwhile, Crash meditated deeply, controlling his breathing and focusing his curse power. At last, he had reached the expert user level. Aura has different stages: user, expert, master, and emperor. The first teaches aura control. The second contains most users and separates true geniuses from ordinary people. Crash was only beginning, while Charlotte, 2 years older, had already reached the aura master level. Her talent was truly remarkable, but even so, despite being a true monster of talent, Charlotte had been powerless against the erosion. Not even she had managed to prevent the end of the world. Compared to Charlotte, Crash was still nothing more than an ant. He did not know whether he could save the world at this rate, but his former self had said he would only know by trying. He had to stop lamenting. He had already suffered enough in that life. This was nothing serious. Before the regression, he could not even use aura, so he had no reason to complain. Even though he was far below his sister's level, Crash could still grow stronger by using the secret art. He was certain he would become much more powerful. When Crash finished meditating, he was slightly sweaty. Ariad was already waiting with a towel and congratulated him on reaching the expert user stage. Crash, however, wanted to know why Ariad was waiting for him there. Ariad explained that his fiancée, Bianca Herdenhortz, had arrived at the Blue Pine Mansion. In the future, she would become a leader used as a pawn by the world devourers and would try to bring everything to ruin. She would become the entity capable of defeating one of the most powerful celestials, earning the nickname White Demon. For now, Bianca Herdenhortz was merely the youngest daughter of a powerful family ruling the North. Crash, regarded as a useless failure, needed her to strengthen his ties with that family. Both of them were being used by their own families for convenience. Even so, Crash had important matters to discuss with her. Bianca Herdenhortz was the youngest daughter of the Riedenhaar family. Her mother had been afflicted by the curse of world erosion even before her birth. Because of this, Bianca Herdenhortz was born bearing the Snow Doll curse. Bianca was born without any emotions. Since the curse had affected her soul, it could not be broken, and her corrupted body also prevented her from forming a contract with God. Because of that, she had been treated as a cursed child ever since she was born. Since her mother lost her life in exchange for her birth, Bianca ended up receiving cold treatment from her own family. Crash believed Bianca hated him back then, but perhaps that would change if he stole her curse. The Snow Doll was necessary to control the poison's fury, so he decided to make a good first impression. Only 5 months earlier, that boy had rejected Bianca. At the time, he believed Bianca Herdenhortz was an opportunist interested only in the Valheim family's power. Bianca, however, showed no reaction at all. Without emotions, she did not even want to attend that meeting with him. Even so, Bianca faced intense pressure from her family. She had to marry someone from the Valheim family to raise the Herdenhard family's prestige. Their future depended on her, and that marriage was her chance to make up for her supposed incompetence. Despite having no emotions, Bianca could still distinguish right from wrong perfectly well. If her family had not forced her into marriage, she would never have chosen to stay beside a sharp-tongued loser like Crash. Yet at that moment, Crash seemed like a different person. He was friendly and gentle, serving tea and showing concern for her. They went to the garden where Crash asked Ariad for macadamia cookies and remarked that the journey must have been tiring. Bianca merely replied that since they were going to marry, meetings like this were necessary. Crash then asked why she remained so formal. After all, as a couple, they could speak much more casually. Naturally, Bianca noticed that something about him was different and strange. During their previous meeting, Crash had looked at her with contempt and behaved extremely unpleasantly. Now, however, he was much better, finally seeming like a civilized person. When Bianca asked whether he was truly the same Crash, he admitted that he was quite different now. He then revealed the new power he had awakened. The demonstration ended up startling Bianca Herdenhortz a little, though Crash had not intended to frighten her. Crash's memories from that time were hazy, so he did not know exactly how he used to treat her. However, there was one thing he still remembered. He remembered that expression on Bianca Herdenhortz's face perfectly. It was exactly the same look she would show when she met her own son. For now, Crash tried to reassure her and change the subject. He said he understood Bianca Herdenhortz's suspicion, since his personality had changed somewhat after forming a contract with God. Bianca Herdenhortz found the explanation reasonable. After all, a contract with God could explain certain changes in his personality. Crash even went so far as to make a proposal. Bianca then asked whether he intended to end the marriage. He replied that it was not exactly that. He fully understood that she might not want to marry someone like him and perhaps would prefer. Perhaps she wanted to cancel the marriage. Bianca Herdenhortz, however, merely thought that Crash seemed to have extremely low self-esteem. Even so, Bianca stated that she was his fiancée and that their engagement would not end so easily. Crash himself was surprised. He had never heard such sincere words in his entire life. Feeling slightly embarrassed, he decided to return to the real subject of their conversation, his newly awakened ability. Crash wanted to use that power to remove the curse Bianca carried. Bianca Herdenhortz knew that several experts had already tried and failed to break her curse. But if Crash truly could succeed, she would accept anything he wanted, including ending the marriage. Bianca knew that Crash was treated as a failure. Therefore, there was surely an enormous barrier between him and the main lineage. He was probably always exhausted, pressured, and dejected, to the point of wishing he could erase his own emotions. That was why he wanted to steal that curse. Perhaps what he was experiencing could be called a disease of the heart. A mental mage had once explained it to Bianca Herdenhortz. When someone reaches the limit of their mental potential, they may develop a disease of the heart. If the person succumbs, the condition can push them to the brink or cause them to change suddenly, becoming kind as though they were someone else. It is an extremely dangerous phase. Changes like that were warning signs that someone was reaching their limit. The mage advised Bianca Herdenhortz to stay close if she ever knew someone in that condition. Bianca Herdenhortz approached and assured him that he would be fine. He only needed to learn to control his emotions without relying on that curse. Crash replied that she had probably misunderstood everything. Even so, she said she would remain by his side, visiting him constantly and even moving near the mansion. Crash then asked whether she hated him. She replied that even so, she would never abandon someone in danger. Crash immediately realized that Bianca was being sincere. After all, Bianca Herdenhortz was exactly the kind of person who devoted herself completely to any decision she made. Crash realized that the whole thing was nothing more than a misunderstanding. If she would not surrender the curse willingly, he would have to rely on his own ability. When he activated the black cloak and touched her heart, the condition required to unlock the power finally appeared. The condition was revealed. He needed to become friends with Bianca Herdenhortz. It seemed simple. To Crash, however, that seemed even harder than marrying her. Bianca barely showed emotion or interest in anyone, making genuine friendship extremely difficult. If he sent her away, it would only be a matter of time before she became the white demon from the original timeline. So Crash decided to keep her close and wait for an opportunity to win her over as an ally. If he could prevent that transformation and obtain the snow doll as well, he would solve two problems at once. Crash decided to play along and said that made him very happy. After all, it was nice to be able to see his future spouse frequently. Bianca Herdenhortz replied, however, that she would first need to confirm it with her father. At the end of that day, she returned to her territory. Crash assumed it would take another month for her to return and decided to spend that time reading secret arts books as the situation was becoming complicated. However, the very next day, a large shipment began arriving at the Blue Pine Mansion. Bianca Herdenhortz was with it. She had returned after only one day, announcing that from that moment onward, she would be living with him. Crash could not understand how everything had happened so quickly. On another ordinary day at the mansion, Bianca Herdenhortz was sleeping peacefully in his bed and had even drooled on the sheets. When she woke up, she asked why he was there. Crash thought that was actually the exact question he should be asking her. Months after he began living with Bianca Herdenhortz, Crash was meditating while concentrating his aura when he remembered the day she arrived. Bianca Herdenhortz explained that moving there was no problem at all, since the Herdenhart family had already given their permission. But that was not what Crash meant. She was only 12 years old, and any ordinary child would probably miss living close to their own family. Bianca, however, was different. Without emotions, her emotional bond with her family also seemed to disappear, leaving her indifferent even to feelings like that. For Crash, however, this also represented an excellent opportunity to finally become her friend. Summer had already passed, and winter was approaching. Bianca had been living there for almost a year. That also meant the opening of Harhern Academy was drawing near. Founded by the 4 great kingdoms in the empire, it trained heroes capable of confronting the world's erosion. Young people between the ages of 15 and 20 could attend. And in the original timeline known to Crash. It was precisely that academy that trained the members of the Azuri generation, all of whom possessed extraordinarily powerful abilities. This time, however, Crash knew those people's weaknesses and intended to exploit them to steal their abilities. He would turn 14 the following year. Therefore, he still had roughly a year before he could enroll, and he intended to make use of every moment. Until then, he wanted to become as strong as possible. The problem was that his talent was already beginning to reach its limit. Crash also began training with the sword in addition to magic. With the secret tome alone, the furthest he could advance was from beginner level to the expert stage. To surpass that limit, he might need to steal the curse of Bianca Herdenhortz's snow doll and learn how to use the immersion poison technique. As she did every day, Bianca Herdenhortz waited for him outside the room because she did not want to leave him alone. She constantly followed Crash around like a chick trailing after a hen. Even so, he still had no idea when Bianca would finally consider him a friend. Perhaps the two of them could go out and do something together in the city. But before that, Ariad came to see him and informed him that an invitation had arrived from the Stellar Sanctuary. It was an annual gathering for the young people of the Kingdom of Starlon, where they socialized and expanded their connections. Before regressing, Crash had been practically confined to the mansion and had never attended that event. Moreover, his memories of that period were rather vague. His brother Belican would also be there, so Crash decided to attend the event and fulfill the promise he had made to Ariad. Naturally, Bianca Herdenhortz confirmed that she would go with him. After all, she practically never left his side. She also warned him that his mere presence there would already attract plenty of criticism. Crash admitted that she was right and suggested that perhaps it would be better for Bianca to remain at the mansion. She insisted on accompanying him, however. After all, was it not a fiancé's duty to protect her partner? Crash, however, was not asking as her fiancé. What he truly wanted to discover was how she sincerely felt. Bianca Herdenhortz, however, did not interpret his behavior as simple kindness, but as a different expression of affection. Over the past few months, Crash had been treating her with unexpected kindness. He prepared breakfast, invited her to the library, and even offered his shoulder so she could take a nap. Bianca had never received so much attention and care, not even when she still lived in the Jardenhortz home. Over time, she could barely remember how poor her first impression of Crash had been. Now, she definitely no longer disliked him. So she said that she would attend the party by his side, not out of obligation as his fiancé, but simply because she wanted to accompany him. Crash replied that, in that case, it was fine. At the end of the day, as the sun was setting, the two traveled by carriage toward the Garayo Pavilion. Garayo Pavilion. That was the correct name, Alec. It was the most famous tourist attraction in the region and had been rented out entirely to host the Stellar Sanctuary event. The nobles there clearly spared no expense. They were respected for confronting the erosion in place of the commoners, but Crash found it strange that so many youths considered the future of Star-Lord preferred parties over training. For that reason, Crash seriously doubted that he would find many genuinely decent people at the Stellar Sanctuary. As soon as they arrived, the two immediately became targets of criticism. Whispers and gossip began spreading everywhere. They were regarded as the two cursed children of their families. One was called an absolute failure, while the other bore the nickname Devil's Doll. Crash finally saw some genuine nobles. They were as arrogant as the others, but unlike many of them, they had some justification for acting that way. After all, they would all eventually become part of the future Azuri generation. Among them were Barak Hogman, the Tiger Beastman, and Emilia, the elf. Lastly, there was Enix Glazer, known as the Wooden Archer. Crash understood perfectly why they were all there. They had come because of Charlotte, something he still remembered from his previous life. Back then, Charlotte had even told Crash that all those young people had gone to the sanctuary specifically to meet her, not because of him. Even so, none of them had come remotely close to defeating her. What annoyed him most was that Charlotte later told Crash all about it, even though he had not participated in the event, purely to show off. Observing the atmosphere around him, Crash figured Charlotte had probably already caused some trouble there. Bianca Herdenhortz told Crash to ignore the comments about him. Judging by her reaction, she had probably mistaken his thoughtful expression for concern. Crash assured her that it truly did not bother him. In fact, he was merely wondering when a certain person would finally appear. As though summoned by his thoughts, Lord Darlene Danfelion appeared. He was an eccentric center of attention and one of the most memorable figures in the Castle of Alchemy. The moment he met Crash, Darlene became fascinated when he realized how many curses had accumulated within his body. He claimed he could try treating him and even joked that Crash would make an excellent research subject. When he moved too close, however, Crash told him to keep his distance. That was how Crash first met Darlene Danfelion, the man who would one day be called the King of Alchemy. Darlene arrived at the gathering and immediately drew everyone's attention with his extravagant and peculiar demeanor. To Crash, it was obvious that he would appear at the event. After all, several young people of the same age had gathered there, providing the perfect setting for his eccentric personality. Crash picked up a tray filled with fruit and sweets, handed it to Bianca Herdenhortz, and asked her to wait for him. She remained there, distracted by the food. After that, Crash approached Darlene, who strangely felt as though he had seen the boy somewhere before. Crash introduced himself as a member of the Valheim family, leaving Darlene impressed to discover that he belonged to the same bloodline as Charlotte. Darlene quickly asked what had caught Crash's interest enough to make him start that conversation. Crash simply replied that he had heard about Darlene's recent research concerning the world's erosion. He then asked whether mentioning that subject was enough to capture his interest. Darlene immediately replied that Crash certainly knew how to provoke his curiosity. Sometime later, the two were already alone inside a room. When Crash revealed that he was only 13, Darlene remarked that his presence seemed far more mature. As he spoke, he began setting aside several training swords for a duel. Crash, however, had no intention of wasting time on that. His goal was to get straight to the main subject. Darlene ignored his impatience, handed him a sword, and immediately began the training match. He wanted to gauge Charlotte's brother's abilities and determine whether Crash was as talented as she was. According to Darlene, they could talk while exchanging blows. Crash blocked the attack effortlessly and immediately counterattacked, maintaining a cold expression. Darlene clearly had not expected a response of that caliber. Crash explained that despite appearances, he trained every day. Even so, he had no intention of using his secret techniques against someone who specialized solely in alchemy. He then stated that he could help Darlene with his research into curse neutralization. Darlene countered that Crash possessed no knowledge of alchemy whatsoever. For that reason, according to him, it would be impossible for Crash to contribute in any meaningful way. However, Crash's next move completely surprised Darlene. Had that duel been serious, the fight would have ended at that very moment. Even so, Crash continued speaking and explained that Darlene's research specifically sought to neutralize the world's erosion curse. Until then, the dispersers had still been unable to undo its effects by using other curses. Darlene needed to complete that research to become a first-class alchemist. Crash claimed he could help and demonstrated his ability to steal curses. Until that moment, Darlene had believed Crash was merely a useless person with no special abilities. But if what he had seen was truly real, it would be the perfect opportunity to advance his research into curse neutralization. Curious, Darlene asked what Crash wanted in return and even joked about whether he wanted him to become his girlfriend. Crash immediately refused. Since he intended to acquire many curses in the future, he wanted Darlene to develop a medicine capable of reducing their effects. After all, relying solely on his ability to steal skills would never be enough. Even the Asura generation, filled with people possessing extraordinary abilities, had failed to prevent the destruction. Alone, someone like Crash would have little chance of surpassing them all. That was why he needed to find other ways to increase his chances. Darlene had already heard rumors that Crash had completely lost his motivation. After all, he had always been looked down upon and compared to Charlotte, whom everyone regarded as a true genius. Yet from what he was seeing now, her brother seemed every bit as interesting as Charlotte. Darlene then asked whether Crash intended to enroll at Hahain Academy in the future. When Crash answered that he did, Darlene's reaction was immediate. The alchemist became visibly excited by his answer. Naturally, Crash intended to go. The academy would gather countless interesting abilities for him to acquire, while Darlene seemed increasingly excited by the idea. Watching that reaction, Crash realized that Darlene truly had not changed at all. He then asked whether he knew about the so-called discoloration disease. It was considered an incurable illness that progressively darkened the skin and eventually put the patient's life at risk. Crash asked Darlene to develop a medicine to treat it. Darlene asked whether Crash truly understood what it meant for a disease to be considered incurable. Crash knew, however, that in the original timeline Darlene had managed to find a solution regardless. Because of that, he decided to trust the alchemist's talent, and the two eventually reached an agreement. At the end of their conversation, Crash casually asked whether Darlene had any interest in his sister. Of course, Darlene was very fond of Charlotte. After all, it was difficult to find anyone who did not like her. Crash was still trying to make sense of the situation when Darlene explained that she was actually interested in both sides. Crash hurried away, wanting nothing more to do with that conversation. Darlene, meanwhile, was already calling him Futuraman. Naturally, Crash made sure to leave as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, someone was causing trouble for Bianca Herdenhortz. The moment that nobleman grabbed Bianca by the wrist, Crash reacted immediately, knocking the man away with a kick to the head. He then demanded to know what the man thought he was doing, trying to take his fiancée away. The nobleman quickly defended himself, saying that he was merely following Princess Claudia's orders. Apparently, Claudia Stallone, the second princess, had ordered Lady Bianca Herdenhortz to be brought before her. When Bianca resisted, the man tried to take her by force. According to him, there was no other choice, since it was a direct order from royalty. Bianca Herdenhortz was the youngest daughter of the Hardenhart family, rulers of the north. Because of her curse, however, she had a rather poor reputation among the nobility. The princess often toyed with her followers, but it seemed strange that she had gone to the trouble of personally summoning Bianca Herdenhortz. Crash began to suspect that there might be some connection he had yet to notice. That was when he remembered Enix Glazer, the man who obsessively pursued Charlotte. After being defeated in a stellar sanctuary, even though he came to hate Charlotte, he still could not abandon his admiration for her, something that eventually affected his sanity. Knowing that he could never defeat Charlotte through his own strength alone, Enix now seemed to have chosen Crash as his new target. Even so, Crash wanted to understand why Bianca Herdenhortz was being dragged into the matter. He then told the young nobleman that everything was fine and that he would meet Enix Glazer personally. Naturally, before doing so, he took his fiancée by the hand and led her away from the danger. As they walked through the corridors, Crash wondered why Bianca had resisted so strongly. He understood who was behind the situation because he had already lived through it before. However, at only 12 years old, Bianca Herdenhortz should not have had enough experience to understand everything that was happening. Crash asked why she had ignored the princess's order. Bianca Bianca replied that he had told her to wait in the hall. Later, at the door, Crash found Barack keeping watch for Enix Glazer, but he allowed Crash inside. Barack revealed that he was curious about Crash and eagerly said that he wanted to fight him. Since he had already fought Charlotte, he believed facing Crash would be much easier. Crash admitted there was some logic to that. After all, Barack had managed to hold out against Charlotte longer than Enix Glazer himself. The problem was that the tiger's combat instincts were extremely unpredictable, making it almost impossible to anticipate his next move. Before reaching Enix Glazer, Crash preferred to avoid any unnecessary confrontation with that man. Barack, however, clearly had no intention of giving up so easily. Without warning, he lunged forward and tried to strike Crash. Crash managed to evade the attack by a hair. Immediately afterward, he ended the confrontation using a technique known as the one-inch punch. It was a short, fast, and powerful attack that struck Barack directly in the stomach. Even so, Barack seemed even more excited and actually considered grabbing a sword to continue the fight. Crash then asked whether he truly believed he could keep fighting. Shortly afterward, Barack's nose began to bleed and he lost consciousness. Bianca Herdenhorst showed some curiosity, so Crash explained that he had used a secret technique belonging to his family. The one-inch punch had been created by a failure of the Valheim family. The technique concentrated maximum force over a minimal distance and, depending on the circumstances, could even cause internal damage. In the original timeline, that was the only technique Crash managed to preserve after the mansion burned down. It was thanks to that technique that he survived. Crash remarked that he had used his best technique, so Barack would probably take quite a while to get back on his feet. When they finally reached the private balcony reserved for Enix Glazer, Amelia appeared looking quite worried, asking where Barack had gone. Enix Glazer found it amusing that Crash had actually defeated that idiot. Even so, he found it strange that his plan had been discovered and began wondering whether the rumors about Crash were true. Crash replied that he himself had spread the rumors that he was useless. However, if Enix lost to him that day, those rumors would certainly change, and Crash was already prepared to steal another ability. Enix Glazer remained by Crash's side from their academy days until the Asura generation. Having spent so many years together, they could be considered old friends. That was why Crash knew Enix very well, including the fact that he had only remained by his side while he considered Crash useful. And Crash discovered that in the worst possible way when one day he found himself at the edge of a cliff about to fall. On that occasion, Crash desperately begged Enix Glazer to help him. Enix replied that if anyone discovered he was responsible for them falling into that trap, he would certainly lose his place in the Asura generation. However, if he alone survived, no one would ever discover the truth. With no witnesses, he could place all the blame on Crash. Since Crash was already hated by almost everyone at the academy, it would be easy to close the matter and conceal the truth about the incident. Enix even had the coldness to thank Crash for being his friend until the very end. Crash already knew that, from the very beginning, Enix had only approached him because of his obsession with pursuing Charlotte. When he learned that Charlotte was going to marry, Enix lost his focus, and that was precisely what led everyone into that mess. Even so, Enix Glazer despised Crash precisely because he believed Crash had no talent whatsoever. Even so, Crash had extremely sharp intuition and represented an obstacle. With Charlotte about to marry, Enix decided that their relationship would end that very day. Perhaps, to Enix, that was even better, since Charlotte certainly would not want to deal with a funeral on her wedding day. However, before Crash could actually fall from that cliff, he was saved by Arthur, who was also part of the Blue Generation. That was how the two of them ended up joining the same team, although it also marked the beginning of an even greater catastrophe. After Enix Glazer was expelled from the Asura generation because of Arthur's testimony, it left him furious. Before, he had tried to marry the princess out of sheer desperation, but now he was pursuing another plan. In this timeline, Enix Glazer remained obsessed with Charlotte. In the end, he had not changed at all. Despite not being particularly close to his sister, Crash decided to defend her. After all, he had never been the type to run from a fight. Crash charged forward with his fist shrouded in black aura, but Enix Glazer blocked the blow with a root. The root wrapped around Crash's leg and hurled him back against the balcony. Just as Crash had expected, that battle would be difficult. After all, Enix Glazer had mastered the Glazer family's secret technique. It was the Celestial Wood style, a technique capable of strengthening plants with aura and freely manipulating them. Combined with the recovery ability, it allowed him to control multiple plants simultaneously and surpass the technique's normal limits. Crash then decided to use a weapon. He pulled out a simple stick from behind him and prepared to face Enix Glazer. He would fight using that very piece of wood he was so fond of. Enix Glazer launched several more pieces of wood directly at Crash. Crash dodged every attack. That would have made sense if he were a genius like Charlotte. However, since Enix Glazer had always considered him useless, he could not understand how Crash had suddenly awakened such tremendous power. To Enix Glazer, Crash was practically his natural enemy. Before the regression, he had seen those abilities so many times that he already knew every detail about them. Crash Crash then asked whether he was still thinking about Charlotte. Enix replied irritably that he had merely remained quiet until now. That did not mean he had no hidden trump card. Immediately afterward, he invoked the fifth form of the celestial wood style, the wood giant. The enormous creature immediately appeared behind the balcony. Even the elf became apprehensive. Enix should not be using a technique like that in such a place. If the giant struck Crash directly, the consequences could be severe and impossible to reverse. Even in the face of that danger, the young Valheim simply closed his eyes. Among the books in the Blue Pine Mansion library was a small secret manual written by an unusual author. Its author was an ancestor who had spent his entire life practicing sword strikes, continuing until the age of 80. He possessed no special talent whatsoever. He simply repeated basic movements tirelessly. In the final years of his life, he recorded his practice in a short and extremely simple manual. However, the technique required complete unity between the user and the object being wielded, a state impossible to achieve through superficial study alone. Since Crash had faced similar situations countless times because of his curse, he naturally managed to understand the principle behind that technique. He became one with the stick, and, using that technique, split the wood giant in half. When the enormous structure collapsed before everyone, Bianca Herdenhortz maintained the same neutral expression as always. Crash then warned Enix Glazer not to be too arrogant. However, Crash had also overestimated his own strength. His original intention had been to hold back a little. Because he had put everything into that attack, his body was completely drained of strength. He could not move a single muscle, much less steal Enix Glazer's ability. Naturally, Bianca Herdenhortz appeared to help him in that condition. She even adjusted his back, making his spine crack. It hurt quite a bit. Darlene remarked that if he kept going like that, the poor boy would end up in terrible condition. He then carried Crash through the hall. The people who had previously criticized Crash continued talking about him, but now they admitted something unexpected. That supposed incompetent had defeated Enix Glazer. Perhaps Crash had also inherited the Valheim family's talent. The rumors spread quickly, and even Darlene ended up feeling proud of the boy. However, Enix Glazer's expression made the alchemist uneasy. He had a feeling that something unpleasant was still going to happen. Crash could not die before helping him complete his research. A week later, Crash had already resumed his sword training. His body had finally recovered from the damage caused by that fight. If he had continued using that power to pressure Enix Glazer, he probably would have ended up in even worse condition than he actually did. And if he had not passed out at that moment, perhaps he could at least have completed the preparations necessary to steal that ability. What bad luck. Even so, Crash had two methods in mind to accomplish it. The first consisted of opening that lock by using a black cloak. The second method was to make his opponent begin doubting his own ability. Crash intended to use precisely the second method against Enix Glazer, taking advantage of his immense pride. After all, his giant had been defeated with a single strike. Losing to someone he despised as useless caused doubt to grow deep within Enix Glazer, shaking the confidence he had in himself. Even if it took some time, Crash believed that Enix Glazer's recovery ability would eventually belong to him. Therefore, over the next year, until he entered the academy, Crash intended to train every day so he could surpass that genius. Upon leaving the training room, Ariad informed him that Belokin had arrived at the Blue Pine Mansion. Crash immediately realized that his brother's patience had finally run out. Ariad had already refused 22 messages from him. Since he could not keep ignoring Belokin forever, Crash finally allowed him to enter. Bianca Herdenhortz offered Crash some water. However, she kept her distance because he was covered in sweat and smelled unpleasant. On top of that, there were also the impurities. The aura caused those impurities to be expelled from the body. Crash had probably grown so accustomed to it that he no longer even noticed the smell. Bianca Herdenhortz recommended that he take a bath and asked him not to come any closer in that state. Crash then jokingly asked whether she was giving orders to her own fiancé. Bianca simply confirmed it and left without wasting any time. Crash knew that he now viewed Bianca Herdenhortz almost as someone he needed to protect. If his old acquaintances from before the regression saw that, they would probably stare at him coldly. It was as though he were merely a tool, using his own human body to fulfill a specific function. Arthur, for example, aside from that final moment, had always been a hero who remained on the front lines. He never lowered his guard. Even so, at that moment he barely understood what he himself was doing. Even his own brother managed to catch him completely off guard. Belokin noticed that Crash was speaking intimately with his fiancée, and the two seemed to be enjoying themselves quite a lot. Crash simply replied that everyone needed some time to relax and have fun. That answer surprised Belokin. Before, Crash could barely look him in the eye out of fear, but now he met his gaze without hesitation. Crash even asked why he was there when he should have been busy. After all, he had heard that the academy would soon begin accepting new students. Since admission would depend on exam results rather than family status, Belokin should start preparing. Belokin could hardly believe that he was being provoked by someone he had always looked down upon. Even the most powerful empire in the world feared Valheim and avoided attacking Stallone. The family stood far above the others, and Belokin belonged directly to its main bloodline. Even so, Crash was telling him that he needed to study for the academy exams. To Belokin, it sounded like a ridiculous provocation. Setting the provocation aside, Belokin had come to deliver an order. They would deal with the world's erosion at Mount Gerlach, although missions of that kind were normally only mandatory after the age of 15. Belokin would accompany his younger brother as his guardian. After all, someone who had defeated Enix Glazer surely would not fear a mission of that level. It was obvious that Belican wanted to test Crash's strength. Even knowing it could be a trap, Crash accepted because he understood erosion well and already had a plan of his own. Crash informed Bianca Herdenhorst that he would be away for a while and made it clear that she could not accompany him. Bianca replied that she had no intention of going anyway. Thinking rationally, sending a 13-year-old child to face a mission like that was completely absurd, and Bianca made a point of saying so directly in front of Belican. Crash had to intervene before his brother became irritated, reminding him that Bianca was his fiancée. He also asked whether Belican was really going to take the words of a 12-year-old girl so seriously. Belican merely showed his displeasure before walking away. After that, Crash told Bianca Herdenhorst that she had done a good job. Bianca simply asked him to be careful and not collapse again. The world's erosion was a phenomenon in which a region of this world was gradually corrupted by the influence of another. Altered creatures could emerge during the process, and on certain occasions, even the climate of the area would change. If the corrosion continued to spread, the region itself would eventually transform into something belonging to another world. At Mount Garelek, a swamp had appeared where none had originally existed. Crash, Belican, and the other members of the squad wore masks because of the toxic and contaminated air in that place. The area had been given a 3-star corrosion rating, a level that an intermediate night order could normally handle without much difficulty. Belican might not seem impressive at first glance, but he was a high-level expert capable of defeating the boss of that zone by himself. Officially, Belican had brought Crash so he could gain experience and prove his worth. However, that was clearly not his true objective. Crash simply continued following his brother, knowing that all this pressure served a purpose. He wanted to temporarily test a possible solution to his own episodes. Later, the squad began having some difficulty dealing with the corrupted insects in the area. After neutralizing one of the creatures, Crash explained that the species did not possess a normal head, but still had dangerous teeth. For that reason, he recommended protecting the body carefully to avoid being bitten. One of the rookies then asked whether Crash had fought those creatures before. Crash remembered that he was only 13 years old. The fact that he could already fight like that was strange enough on its own. Belican began growing uneasy because he could not understand how Crash remained so calm during his first visit to a corroded zone. When Belican had entered a similar place at 15, his pride had been shattered. He had felt humiliated and eventually fled in fear. His younger brother, however, merely looked at him with a calm smile. That attitude only made Belican feel even more frustrated. As he moved through the swamp, Belican began wondering what would happen if Crash grew like Charlotte and someday surpassed him. In that case, Belican might end up being seen as the true failure of Valheim. Shortly afterward, however, he and the platoon finally reached their destination. Belican remarked that Crash was lucky. That mission seemed far easier than his first experience, since no other species appeared besides the bosses. Crash disagreed and said that was precisely why they needed to be even more cautious. There was probably a 3-star boss capable of sustaining all that corrosion by itself. Some soldiers became uneasy, but Belican told everyone to calm down. To him, it was still only a 3-star threat that should be eliminated quickly. Crash thought that everyone would soon understand the situation on their own. Until then, he only needed to focus on what he had come there to do. Crash could easily see the energy flowing from that corrupted world. His perception was far sharper than in his previous life. All that remained was to absorb that energy. He removed his mask and began inhaling the contaminated air around him directly. Soon afterward, his body reacted badly, and he ended up coughing up a large amount of blood. Ben Hawking remarked that Crash seemed to be pushing himself too hard for someone facing this for the first time. Analyzing his body's reaction, Crash realized that it was not merely a normal physical effect. The corrupted energy acted like an extremely potent poison. It was exactly what he had expected. Even so, there was no alternative, and that was precisely why he had previously mastered the extreme immersion poison. According to the secret manual, he first needed to blend his own aura with the surrounding energy. If his aura flowed like a great river and absorbed the corruption, the two would eventually merge. That fusion would create a new form of energy. The initial effect, however, left Crash extremely dizzy, something he would have struggled to endure under normal circumstances. For that reason, the time had come to use the other secret technique he had prepared. After Damaris Valheim, the library was sealed, and over time people came to believe that its records had vanished completely from history. Years later, a blind ancestor discovered the secret archive. Since he could not read its contents, he chose to leave it sealed and preserved only a single manual there for future generations. The technique recorded in that manual was called Sixth Sense, also known as extrasensory perception. It allowed the user to perceive different sensations through aura. Crash could still extend it only as far as his fingertips, but that was already enough to realize that this was not a world completely consumed by erosion. Gradually, his condition began to stabilize. Using Sixth Sense, Crash managed to overcome that difficulty. Of course, that was only a temporary solution. If he kept absorbing the energy of the corrupted corrupted world, he could lose control at any moment. In that case, he would still need Bianca Herdenhortz's cursed doll. Even if it was only a temporary measure, that did not change the fact that he had managed to endure it. However, immediately afterward, Crash sensed a terrifying presence approaching. Right beside him, a face suddenly appeared, staring at him from atop an unnaturally long neck. That aberration was part of the area's boss, a massive chimeric creature resembling a worm made of flesh. Hidden among countless bodies was Senganki, the thousand-faced demon, a 3-star boss. Naturally, everyone immediately took up combat positions. Belican activated Ignis, his flaming sword ability. The squad members remarked that the ability was impressive as always. Its destructive power was immense, and Crash remembered that very well. After all, that same ability had once burned his arm. Before the regression, his brother had been completely unstable. Crash still did not know what he was like now. Even so, he hoped Belican had not changed. After all, Crash was already prepared to steal that curse. Meanwhile, Senganki began taking the face of one of the knights. The man collapsed unconscious soon afterward. That was the curse capable of completely erasing someone's face. Even the most experienced veteran knights were struggling tremendously against it. Crash immediately understood how serious the situation was. Senganki truly deserved to be considered a powerful 3-star boss. Belican charged with his flaming sword and struck the creature, knocking it down. The monster writhed in pain. Both the flames and Belican's imposing presence had an immediate effect that restored the knights' morale and encouraged them to return to battle. Belican clearly wanted to prove his superiority before his brother. Crash, however, paid him no attention and kept his eyes fixed solely on the creature. Every face on the demon began shedding red tears while screaming in agony. Something was clearly wrong. Crash realized that the situation would soon become extremely dangerous. A crushing pressure spread across the entire battlefield. Belican needed to finish that creature before something worse happened. He charged his attack with aura and flames, but nothing happened. Belican ordered the knights to attack immediately, before the creature could complete its transformation. However, everyone remained motionless, staring at him. Their faces had simply vanished. Soon afterward, even Belican's right eye began to be consumed by the curse. Senganki had managed to reach him. If this continued, Belican would certainly fall, and the thousand-faced demon would take his face as well. That was when Crash revealed that he possessed a secret technique capable of helping him. It was something Charlotte had taught him. In fact, it was thanks to that same technique that he had been able to face Enix Glazer in the sanctuary. Belican wondered whether that girl truly had emotions and asked Crash whether he believed he could defeat the demon. Crash replied that he could. Rather than flee only to become lost in that corrupted area, it was better to try. He understood that Belican did not trust him. Even so, he could trust Charlotte's skill. Belican swallowed his pride and stood up, warning that if they failed, they were both finished. Crash, however, was certain the plan would work. The two hid for a moment while Belican remained severely weakened. Belican prepared his flaming ability once again. Crash then said they could put the plan into action. As he drew his sword, Crash concentrated an extraordinarily powerful aura, displaying remarkable focus. Even Belican was surprised. The purity of that aura was extraordinary. Belican had hesitated when Charlotte tried to teach him that technique. No matter how much he trained, he simply could not master it. That raised the question of how Crash had managed to master that aura. Belican ended up distracted by his own brother, who asked to borrow the power of Ignis. Now, all that remained was to see the result. At that moment, Crash was combining his pure aura with the power of the flaming sword. However, Crash stopped Belican and said he could finish everything in time. His brother did not need to buy him any more time. The flames surrounding Crash burned with greater intensity than Belican had ever been able to produce. That strike would probably be enough to defeat the thousand-faced demon. Belican had lost his subordinates in mere moments and had only managed to escape with his life. To him, it was an enormous humiliation. When Crash unleashed the strike, he did not merely destroy the demon. At that moment, the pride and reputation Belican still believed he possessed also collapsed. Belican then tried to attack his own brother, but Crash blocked him easily. At that point, Belican could no longer control Ignis. As he transformed the power of Ignis into black flames, Crash thanked his brother for never changing. 3 conditions were required to unlock Belican's power. He had to willingly give part of Ignis to his opponent, acknowledge that his opponent controlled it better, and finally, have his pride completely shattered. And so, before the demon still engulfed in flames, Crash brought his own brother down. Crash picked up a charred fragment of the creature with the tip of his sword and remarked that he also wished to have a better relationship with his siblings. From the beginning, however, that possibility had seemed distant. No matter how much he tried, the hostility between them prevented that wish from becoming reality. Crash placed the demon's charred fragment into Belican's mouth, saying that despite everything, they were still brothers. Deep down, Crash still held a faint hope of finally being acknowledged by his brother. However, faced with the demonic corrosion, Belican no longer had much choice. Belican ended up losing his remaining eye as well. Soon afterward, he began to lose all of his senses. His body reacted violently to the pain until, at last, the weather became surprisingly pleasant, creating an almost ironic contrast with everything that had happened. Back at the Valheim main residence, Belican's funeral vigil was being held. The news also confirmed that his Knight Order had been almost completely destroyed. The corrosion was then reclassified as 5-star, and they concluded that a higher-ranking specialist would need to be summoned. People said that if Belokan had not sacrificed himself, Crash probably would not have survived. Naturally, the stewards serving the family were deeply troubled by that situation. After all, the one regarded as the family's failure had been the only one to survive. As he left the funeral, Crash thought that thanks to his brother, he had achieved far better results than expected. He confirmed that he could control the episodes connected to his sixth sense, and had also become better prepared to use the blood's extreme immersion poison. In addition, thanks to Ignis, he now possessed black flames, an ability capable of setting almost anything ablaze. By applying those flames to the power of world corrosion, Crash achieved a result he had never imagined possible. The problem was that an investigation had begun into the abnormal phenomena occurring within the world corrosion zones. So far, however, no one seemed to know the true cause. Even though it was the work of a world invader, his main body remained trapped in eternal sleep. Because of that, he could only observe the real world through the undead. Under those circumstances, Crash was now meeting Saphira, a fourth-class investigator from the team responsible for world corrosion. The moment he saw her, however, Crash immediately noticed the black star marked on the investigator's neck. He then declared to the undead being that he wanted to make a deal, claiming that he could remove its immortality. She had not expected to hear that. She had been searching for something else and never imagined she would end up facing a target that seemed so insignificant. In the previous timeline, Arthur and the Azuri generation captured Garden, the Crimson Immortal. After failing to steal his immortality, they decided to keep him chained inside a volcano. That way, all of Garden's energy would be consumed, endlessly regenerating his body, preventing him from ever escaping. While other people argued among themselves and clearly created new problems, Arthur saw only one real problem: Crash, who had failed to steal that immortality. Even after being reborn, Crash believed accomplishing that would remain practically impossible because of the absurdly difficult conditions. To unlock that ability and steal it, he would first have to become stronger than the immortal himself. The investigator then asked Crash directly whether he was someone who had regressed through time. Crash had no idea what had led that woman to reach such a conclusion. She explained that an ordinary child would never propose such a bold deal. To her, it only made sense if Crash were a regressor. Someone bound to the gears of time claiming to be capable of eliminating a being who transcended time itself sounded to Garden like a blatant lie that was impossible to believe. Crash, however, simply revealed his ability, the Black Cloak. With that power, he really could steal that person's immortality. Garden had continuously expanded the world corrosion precisely in the hope of finding someone capable of finally ending his existence. Now, for the first time, someone had appeared who could take that curse for himself. Faced with that, Garden asked what conditions Crash wanted to impose on the deal. Crash replied that he only needed to become stronger, since his ability would work only once he surpassed Garden himself. Garden then offered to make him his disciple. In exchange for being freed from that curse, he said he would even be willing to surrender his soul. It was decided. The Crimson Immortal Garden Auguste would make Crash the most powerful man still alive. The Immortal's presence was so overwhelming that Crash could barely remain standing beneath that aura. Garden was powerful enough to rival Arthur and also commanded extremely strong subordinates. With his help, Crash could certainly increase his own power tremendously. Even if he had to rely on the power of an invader from another world, Crash would accept it. Preventing world corrosion, annihilation, and the end of that world justified the price. Because only one person could possess a given unique ability, regression had returned to Arthur in this life. Crash could no longer use it again by his own will. If he failed to save the world now, he would disappear for good. Still trembling beneath that presence, Crash formally greeted his new master. Garden returned the greeting by giving the boy a hard slap on the head. On the way back, Crash remarked that he could finally return home. Garden asked whether he did not live there, and Crash explained that he had barely stayed at the family's main residence. Along the way, however, Crash was stopped by Valkyria, a member of Valheim's Direct Order of the Knights of Law, who informed him that his mother wished to see him. Crash found that strange, since she had not even appeared while he was at the Blue Pine Mansion. If she wanted to see him now, she had probably heard the rumors about his sudden change. Valkyria added that this was not the only reason. When the family had returned from the Forbidden Domain, he also wished to meet Crash personally. That surprised Crash even more. His father had reached the level of a demigod and might have noticed some change in his son through the stars. For that reason, Ariad had been instructed to make Crash remain at the main residence until the family had returned. Crash, however, could not waste that time. Bianca Herdenhorst was waiting, and there was still much to do. Besides, staying there overnight had not been a direct order from his father. So he decided to return home immediately. Once his father returned, he could come back again or even visit him personally. Without prolonging the conversation any further, Crash entered his carriage and returned home. Garden complained that his new disciple was extremely rude. The Immortal remained outside in the form of a crow while Crash explained that his presence would attract far too much attention inside the mansion. To remain more discreet, Garden changed his appearance and took the form of a completely black crow instead of his previous reddish coloring. That was much better and drew far less attention. Even so, Crash wanted to know what was happening with Garden's true body. The Immortal replied that, as a regressor, Crash should know perfectly well that his real body remained motionless. Crash thought that the true regressor was Arthur. He merely used that ability incompletely, but he had had no intention of explaining that detail to the man. When they reached the mansion, Crash warned his master that a small white chick lived at Blue Pine and asked him to be gentle with her. That so-called chick was Bianca Herdenhortz, who at that very moment was literally dressed like a chick wearing her pajamas. Meanwhile, Ariette appeared looking deeply worried and informed him that a letter from Darlene had arrived. In the message, Darlene said that the medicine Crash had requested for the discoloration disease was ready. He had prepared everything quickly and promised to deliver it soon, ending the letter in a rather affectionate tone. Crash found that strange and remarked that geniuses really did have their peculiarities. He then asked the steward to treat Darlene Danfelian carefully if he appeared, since he was his benefactor. Ariette also whispered that Lady Bianca Herdenhortz had been extremely worried during his absence, especially after learning that Crash had been involved in a corrosion incident. She had even packed her own luggage to go after him, but Ariette managed to stop her from leaving. Taking advantage of that moment, Crash decided to check the progress of the first condition. To his surprise, it had already been unlocked. Crash had finally become friends with Bianca Herdenhortz. Crash stared at Bianca for so long that she eventually asked whether there was something on her face. He replied that it was nothing and quickly played it off, taking the opportunity to introduce his new companion. It was the crow Krim. Bianca Herdenhortz hugged him and said he was as cute as a stuffed bear. Apparently, she was quite fond of animals, especially birds. While Krim was being squeezed in her arms, Crash thought about how to open the second lock. To do that, he needed to become someone even more important to Bianca. When speaking of important people, we usually think of relatives, children, friends, or lovers. Since he was already her fiancé, becoming someone she loved seemed like the closest possibility. However, winning the love of someone who practically had no emotions was far from an easy task. Crash remarked that the pale girl seemed to have taken quite a liking to him. After all, she probably was not very fond of the sun. Krim then asked whether Crash was ready to test his strength, since it was already time for them to begin training. Sometime later, Crash was already sprawled on the ground. It was rather pathetic to think that a regressor could be so mediocre. He had barely managed to reach that level by relying on experiences from his previous life and secret techniques. Even so, his efforts certainly deserved some recognition. A person could become a genius in less than 5 years if talent alone were enough. However, before an immortal, talent meant little. Crash had his ability precisely so he could steal what he lacked. Crash, who would never climb out of the abyss on his own, could now be raised up by the Crimson Immortal. Once he reached the necessary level, he would finally be able to steal his immortality and free him from that cursed cycle. Crash replied that there was no need to explain. That was exactly what he intended to do. The next morning, Darlene appeared and immediately began acting excessively friendly toward Crash. He showed him that the medicine was finally ready and proudly declared himself a genius. Crash replied that this was nothing new, since Darlene always said the same thing. Darlene thanked him with a hug, but Crash immediately pushed him away and told that man to get away from him. Before leaving, however, the alchemist said there was one more thing he still needed to tell him. According to Darlene, Onyx Glazer had changed after those events. He had stopped training after losing to Charlotte, but resumed his exercises after everything that happened at the sanctuary. Crash concluded that the man had probably become motivated after losing to him, though it hardly mattered. Crash said that if they were already finished, they could leave. The immortal agreed, since he intended to use an elixir to strengthen that still mediocre body anyway. He also told Crash to ask the famous star of alchemy for some special tonics capable of increasing his physical attributes. Elixirs were extremely expensive, and certain crafting techniques were passed down only within specific bloodlines. They were resources reserved for a select few and something completely beyond Crash's reach in his previous life. Since Krim knew the formula, he could teach the method to the alchemist through Crash. He would still need to pay for the materials, but Crash believed he could handle that using all the knowledge he had acquired after regressing. Krim then relayed every detail to Crash, who became responsible for translating the instructions for Darlene. The alchemist was both surprised and impressed. As he wrote everything down, he asked where Crash had obtained such valuable information. Krim looked visibly proud, while Crash had to make up a story that the knowledge came from a secret hidden within his family. In theory, the formula was excellent. The real problem would be obtaining all the necessary ingredients. Not even Darlene could obtain the sun snow fungus or the golden dragon herb. The fungus grew in hardened hearts, but the steep mountains and severe corruption made harvesting it nearly impossible. As for that, Crash naturally intended to ask his own fiancée for help. The golden dragon herb, meanwhile, was considered a phantom plant, supposedly found only near golden dragon nests in remote regions of the Empire. It might be possible to buy it on the black market, although they would be ruined if the Empire discovered them. Even so, if no alternative appeared, Crash was willing to take that risk. Darlene, however, found another possibility. In the Epiphany Empire, a youth martial arts tournament was held for participants under the age of 15. If Crash took first place, he could receive the golden dragon herb itself as the prize. Crash remembered that he was a Valheim. Since the Empire used the tournament as part of a political struggle against the Academy, his participation could create a rather complicated situation. Darlene, naturally, already had a plan. He handed Crash a potion whose appearance seemed somewhat suspicious. As soon as he drank the liquid, Crash transformed into a girl. Darlene explained that he could participate in the tournament without revealing his identity. Outraged, Crash demanded to know what he had done and ordered him to restore his original body. However, when Darlene realized that Crash was about to resort to his curse, the alchemist immediately apologized. apologized. A few days later, the potion's effect finally wore off and Crash regained his original appearance. As he continued training with Krim, he had already become considerably more powerful. His reflexes now resembled those of someone who was truly beginning to master part of the sixth sense. Even so, when the training ended, he collapsed exhausted onto the ground. The Crimson Immortal had taught him the Pure Blade technique, an advanced method capable of interpreting enemy attacks without retreating and rapidly understanding every movement. Combined with Crash's natural intuition and sixth sense, this technique brought him closer to a state of clairvoyance. If he strengthened his body with elixirs, his movements would finally be able to keep pace with his thoughts. When that happened, his strength would increase even further. The time to depart had also arrived. Crash prepared his cloak, gathered his equipment, and made everything ready. Among his items was a new potion, this time one that would not transform him into a woman. Days earlier, Darlene had tried to redeem himself by giving him that vial and explaining that the previous transformation had been nothing more than a joke. The new potion lasted approximately 1 day. Darlene was reliable when he was actually working, but dealing with his personality remained extremely exhausting. Upon leaving the residence, Crash found Bianca Herdenhortz, his butler, and a merchant waiting for him. Ariad had arranged entry into the lawless zone, and the merchant would help Crash cross illegally while keeping him hidden among the flow of creatures. Ariad also promised that he would prevent anyone from entering the estate while Crash was away. The next day, after Darlene delivered the medicine intended to treat the discoloration disease, Ariad thanked Crash with profound sincerity. He then swore loyalty and promised to serve him until the end. With that, Crash finally stopped worrying about a possible betrayal by his butler. In addition, Bianca Herdenhortz had also accepted the request he had made. He remarked that it had been a long time since she had last visited her home, so she could take the opportunity to spend a few days with her family. However, she had no intention of staying there. She would collect the fungus and return immediately, saying that she would wait for him to come back. He replied that he would also try to return as quickly as possible. He then noticed that the basket she had given him was filled with small snacks prepared for the journey. After wishing him a safe trip, she said goodbye, and Crash set off toward the Empire. Later, during the journey, he used the time to train his Ignis and practice absorbing corrosion. Thanks to Sixth Sense, his condition remained quite stable. The merchant followed a route that avoided the corrupted regions. It was unfortunate that Crash could not absorb much energy along the way, but there was little he could do about it. Everything proceeded normally until a group of bandits suddenly attacked them on that very alternative route, proving that the path was not as safe as it seemed. The merchant was surrounded before she even noticed the criminals lurking around her. However, she barely had time to worry, as Crash neutralized the attackers within moments. The bandit group was large, but that meant little to Crash. Without showing any difficulty or emotion, he defeated every attacker as though he were dealing with insignificant enemies. The last one put up more resistance, attacking with tremendous force using a massive axe. Even so, Crash anticipated every movement and blocked each strike with precision. Realizing that the boy seemed to be looking down on him, the bandit decided to use his true trump card. He executed Phantom Battle Axe, a feinting technique capable of suddenly changing the direction of an attack. Crash parried the strike with his flaming sword and asked whether he was a disciple of the Killer Hound, since he recognized the technique perfectly. The so-called Killer Hound was the servant of an invader from another world, subordinate to the White Demon Bien. In the future, he was supposed to infiltrate the kingdom and claim countless victims before finally being stopped by Charlotte. After incapacitating the assassin, Crash began seriously wondering what was happening in that place. It was because of that very incident that Charlotte would become famous throughout the Empire. Yet at this point in history, the infiltration should not even have begun. Then why were that man's subordinates already operating there so early? After removing the traces left behind by the bandits, Crash remarked that he was beginning to have a very bad feeling. Even so, he decided to simply obtain the Golden Dragon Herb and leave as quickly as possible. It was not his responsibility. Sometime later, he finally arrived in Ceylon, the imperial capital. The hall used for martial arts tournament registration was completely packed with participants. Meanwhile, the fourth princess of the Aphania Empire watched with interest to see how the event would unfold. She was searching for promising talents to bring to her academy. Her subordinate remarked that if His Majesty discovered what she was doing, he would probably be furious. The princess replied that she would rather not talk about her father, since he had some rather strange ideas. That young woman was Cicely Ifani, the emperor's youngest daughter. Since the age of 7, Cicely had displayed exceptional intelligence, capable of solving extremely complex mathematical problems. Many wanted to make her a candidate for the throne, but Cicely knew that with her frail constitution, entering that struggle would place her life in serious danger. For that reason, she decided to abandon her image as a prodigy. Little by little, she stopped acting like a genius and began behaving like a troublesome girl. Over time, even those who had once deeply admired her intelligence eventually gave up on her. Cicely's subordinate knew that it was all an act, although lately the princess had been taking the role rather too far. Suddenly, Cicely pointed downward and remarked that she had found a very interesting candidate. It was a narrow-eyed boy with a crow perched on his shoulder. To her, his appearance made him look like some kind of villain. Curious, Cicely leaped down from the mezzanine to immediately find out who the boy was. As expected, the attempt did not end very well, and she stumbled as soon as she touched the ground. Fortunately, the boy carrying the crow managed to catch her before anything happened. He simply told her to watch where she was going and continued on his way without saying anything else. Cicely found the calm way he spoke curious, as though he knew perfectly well who he was dealing with. Later, Crash completed his registration for the tournament. Now he only needed to find an inn for the night. The problem was that every establishment was full because of the tournament. It seemed he would have to find another place to sleep. Just then, an elderly woman unexpectedly appeared and offered him a place to stay. Krim remarked that it seemed extremely suspicious, but Crash accepted the offer without showing any concern. The immortal grew irritated by his lack of caution, but Crash explained that he had spent far too much time sleeping outdoors in his previous life and had no desire to repeat that experience. Krim replied that Crash definitely was not the interesting type of regressor. In fact, he was the annoying kind. However, the moment Crash entered the inn, he found Cicely waiting there. It was obvious that the offer had been arranged as a trap. Even after realizing this, Crash simply tried to ignore her and head straight to his room. Cicely complained that such an adorable girl was trying to speak with him, yet he still ignored her. She then teased him by asking whether he had unusual tastes. That remark immediately reminded Crash of Darlene. He simply replied that Cicely was not his type. There were plenty of prettier people in the world, and he had no obligation to satisfy her curiosity. After that, he maintained a guarded demeanor and avoided revealing any unnecessary information. Cicely tried inviting him to a meal because she wanted to know him better, but Crash refused without hesitation. Cicely then revealed that she knew he came from Stallone and asked whether he would continue behaving that way even before a princess. Crash realized that any slip could reveal that he belonged to the Valheim family. For that reason, he pretended not to understand what she meant and said that a child should finish dinner quickly and then go to sleep. Irritated, Cicely immediately demanded to know exactly who he was calling a child. The subordinate asked whether that boy truly came from Stallone, and Cicely replied that she was absolutely certain. Although he spoke the same language used throughout the Empire, that man had a rather distinctive accent. The female knight remarked that noticing such a subtle difference was something practically only she could do. Cicely possessed a mind capable of processing details ordinary people would never notice. It was an ability very close to the so-called mind's eye. The female knight even suggested capturing the boy for interrogation, but Cicely refused. Things were becoming far too interesting. She then asked whether there had been any important discoveries concerning her sister. The female knight replied that, in fact, everything had happened exactly as she had imagined. The third princess seemed like a completely different person from who she had been only a year earlier. Cicely had noticed the change as well. Her sister was far more dangerous now, and she was certain that a great tragedy would soon strike the palace. In the final match of the preliminaries, Crash easily defeated his opponent with his 1-inch punch, also causing extensive damage to part of the arena. The people around him commented that he looked more like a creature that had crawled straight out of the depths of hell. The raven perched on his shoulder also drew attention. Krim, however, asked whether Crash's expression had something to do with the girl who had been bothering him so much. She could extract information simply through conversation. Naturally, that made Crash extremely cautious. At least Crash was satisfied that none of it had interfered with the preliminaries. He had overcome every opponent without much difficulty. The preliminaries gathered 100 participants, but only the top 4 advanced. Since Crash considered the others fairly weak, his qualification was practically guaranteed. Backstage at the arena, a boy covered in bandages and wrappings approached Crash and asked whether he belonged to the Night Ravens. The Night Ravens were foreign assassins feared as one of the most dangerous forces in the underworld. In Crash's original timeline, they would directly contribute to the Empire's future downfall. Crash did not know every detail because he was not from that place, but he had never heard of anyone from that family entering the academy, so he told the boy that he was not part of the Night Ravens. The bandaged boy merely wanted to make friends with someone connected to the underworld. He accepted the answer and introduced himself in a friendly manner. Krim, however, noticed that there was something strange about the boy, so he decided to act. He temporarily took control of the bandaged boy's body. Then he used mind control to force him to reveal all the information he possessed. Under the effect of the ability, the boy revealed that the Night Ravens had recently faced a serious crisis. Even so, they were also participating in the martial arts tournament. Everything was happening under the orders of a new master, the very person responsible for putting them in that situation. That master was the second prince of Ephania, the brother of Sigram and Cicely. In truth, the Night Ravens were part of a trap prepared by Ephania against the nobles. The group was being used to observe, manipulate, and track the movements of those nobles. Since the imperial family had controlled everything from the beginning, calling that prince their new master seemed rather strange. The connection between the Night Ravens and the imperial family was supposed to remain hidden from the public until Ephania itself fell. Yet even a low-ranking member controlled by Krim knew the secret. Crash also knew that, originally, the second prince was supposed to expand the first prince's influence. Now, however, they planned to eliminate the second prince to weaken the first. Crash began wondering who would truly benefit from all of this. It was at that moment that Crash realized they really had inherited Arthur's memories. In that case, with knowledge of the future, Sigram would probably target the very person who would die after hiding the Emperor's symbol. It was the White Dragon Pearl, the fourth Princess Cicely, the one responsible for making Arthur an emperor entitled title alone. To ensure that she could hand Arthur the throne she had secured, Sigrun first needed to eliminate the sister who posed a problem. If Sigrun became empress, Ephania would eventually fall. As a consequence, there would be a massive overflow of world erosion. To prevent the end of the world, Crash needed to interfere with her plans. For that reason, he decided to steal Sigrun's ability. Naturally, the immortal would help as well. Normally, someone who had returned from the future would make decisions based only on the information they possessed. However, since he had decided to lend his power to Crash, he would also participate directly in that plan. Prim then asked what they would do with the boy who was still under control. Crash answered without much concern, saying that he had already revealed everything they needed. Since there was no longer any reason to keep him there, Garden ordered the boy to return to where he had come from. Crash then declared that it was time to make use of that appearance. Disguised like this, he could find the real Night Raven hidden within the tournament. Meanwhile, other people were already watching Crash closely, considering him a troublesome competitor. And look who is still following this story all the way to this point. If you have not left a like yet, now is your chance. Subscribe to the channel as well if you have not already, and turn on notifications. Share it too with that friend you think would enjoy following this story. Done all that already? Then great, now we can continue. Thought I would let you off that easily, not a chance, leave a like first. During the main event, in match 32, Crash easily dominated his opponent. When he finally secured the victory, the entire audience began calling him a Night Raven as they cheered for his performance. By that point, practically everyone was convinced that he truly belonged to the group. Even the princess started calling him that while watching the fight with great enthusiasm. On the night after the preliminaries ended, Crash sought out the princess solely to deliver an important warning. She needed to be careful and protect herself. The princess, however, had no idea how Crash had managed to uncover that information. She asked Sarah whether they could truly trust the royal spy they had hired. As a precaution, Sarah decided to verify everything again. Crash knew that if Sisley was still there watching even after his warning, then she had probably already figured out her sister's plan. He also suspected that Sisley had already realized his identity as a Night Raven was merely a disguise. And indeed, backstage at the arena, another man appeared and asked whether pretending to be a Night Raven was entertaining. It was not the same person as before, but the situation felt familiar. Crash simply had not expected to encounter him so soon. The assassin reacted quickly, drawing 2 daggers and charging forward to attack. Crash deliberately stepped into the trap and seized both of the assassin's arms. The man then summoned bone structures resembling claws, but Crash destroyed the spikes. Immediately afterward, Crash struck his opponent with a headbutt. His resistance was practically useless. After all, forbidden arts fueled by the power of world corruption simply did not work against Crash. Crash then revealed that he knew who he was, Ibelesk. The assassin himself was stunned, unable to understand how his true identity had been discovered. Crash added that he also knew Ibelesk's heart was with Sigrun. He then asked where she was at that moment because he intended to make her an offer. With his ability, it would be possible to restore her heart. In return, she could reveal everything about Sigrun's plan. Night Crow, or rather, the necromancer Ibelesk Benapot. Her heart had been stolen, and she had spent 1,000 years imprisoned by the Empire. On top of that, she was a corruptor, an invader from another world. Arthur once said she might prove useful and brought her into the group. Ibelesk, however, saw Crash as someone destined to suffer even more than she had. The Azuri generation disliked invaders from other worlds, and Ibelesk lived in isolation. Everyone only knew that she was the sole necromancer in existence, never imagining that she was also the Night Crow. Corpses do not reveal information, even when an assassination mission fails. Besides, a necromancer capable of controlling them could always keep crows circling above the bodies. Everything pointed to Ibelesk and her family, who were known for assassinations. Since the Night Crow disappeared during the Academy days, Crash never learned her identity and began suspecting that Arthur had captured her. Crash arrived without ceremony and broke down the door. Garden remarked that his disciple was especially rough that day, mainly because he had just destroyed the entrance to Ibelesk's hideout, a room that looked more like a small den. Without wasting any time, Crash pulled away the blanket covering her and remarked that the necromancer seemed far too comfortable. Ibelesk had no idea what he intended until Crash explained that he was there to find her heart. Before that, Crash decided to personally demonstrate what he could do and activated the black cloak. That was when he realized Ibelesk's ability was protected by an enormous number of locks. Crash told the necromancer that if she entrusted her heart to him, he could recover it at that very moment. Ibelesk claimed that she trusted him, but her words were not sincere enough. The locks remained completely sealed. Crash then asked whether she was not already tired of that life. If she recovered her heart, she could spend her days resting peacefully in her room. She could leave the corpses to handle the work while she ate and entertained herself however she wanted. If she failed to recover her heart, however, she would remain a servant forever. Naturally, Ibelesk was already tired of working and wanted nothing more than a comfortable life. To prove it, she summoned several bodies she had hidden inside that room. She then asked Crash for help, saying that she had already worked for more than 1,000 years and did not want to continue living that way. Crash replied that in that case, she had no choice but to truly entrust her heart to him. Since mere words were not enough, Crash gently stroked her head and asked her to truly trust him. Abellis confessed that her only wish was to live a peaceful life, spending the entire day doing nothing, just as anyone seeking rest would want. At that moment, the chains binding her heart finally shattered. Crash told her she was free, but reminded her that he expected her to fulfill her side of the agreement. The necromancer then began explaining the true plan in detail. The target was connected to Cicely herself. To keep anything from appearing suspicious, certain sacrifices would have to occur, so Crash decided to let events unfold according to the original plan. Sarah ultimately lost her life at the hands of Mary Diana, one of the girls who had returned to the past carrying memories connected to Arthur. Everything happened under Mary Diana's orders and, naturally, also followed Sigram's instructions. Ibelisk was supposed to recover and control Sarah's body so it could be used in the plan against the fourth princess. Mary Diana had already returned to the past a year earlier. Since then, she and Sigrid had worked hard to rebuild the good times they had once known. One day before the destruction, Arthur promised that on the first Saturday after the regression, at 1 in the afternoon, he would meet the two of them in front of the Statue of Peace. They were overjoyed by that promise, but Arthur never appeared. An entire year had already passed, and the girls were still waiting for him without any sign. Following Sigram's words, Mary Diana decided to keep believing in Arthur. Until his return, she would regain her former strength and once again become the Empire's most powerful spear, ensuring the success of that mission with Abelisk. Through the body sent to retrieve the corpse, Mary Diana asked the necromancer whether that boy named Kraid, a participant in the martial arts tournament, was truly under her control. When Abelisk confirmed it, Mary Diana commented that she had good taste. After all, she had gone to considerable effort using the crow to make her presence known. Even so, Mary Diana warned Abelisk not to try anything strange merely because Sigram was absent, since her true heart was still in their hands. Abelisk assured her that she would never do anything suspicious and soon left to collect every body. Mary Diana knew that the necromancer normally chose unattractive corpses, so she found it strange that she had hidden someone as handsome as Crash Valheim. To her, treating him as a mere corpse was almost a waste. Later, Crash was surprised when he discovered who his opponent would be in the final of that tournament. It was Pyre, a commoner only 14 years old who had made it all the way to the final. At first glance, he seemed like an ordinary and kind-hearted boy, someone who dreamed of world peace. At least, that was the image Pyre wanted to project. In truth, he would become a powerhouse comparable to members of the Azuri generation, despite never attending the academy. For the first time in that tournament, the Nightcrow finally drew his sword, causing the entire audience to erupt with excitement. Before the fight, Pyre began by saying that he knew Crash did not wish to remain an assassin. He had also heard that no nation could interfere in the affairs of Hare Academy. Since both of them had already reached the final, admission to the academy was practically guaranteed. Pyre believed Crash could abandon the Nightcrow and live a normal life. Crash thought Pyre truly was a kinder person than he had expected. Before the duel began, however, Crash warned that someone too attached to their own hopes might be unable to keep moving forward once they finally encountered despair. For that reason, Crash directly rejected Pyre's proposal. The moment the duel began, the young commoner immediately used 10 heavenly steps. Pyre surged forward in the blink of an eye and unleashed an extraordinarily fast attack, but Crash perfectly predicted the feint and blocked with his own sword. It was as though he knew all of Pyre's swordsmanship, evading and defending against every strike without difficulty. Pyre was so startled that he looked as though he had seen a ghost. In a way, he was not far from the truth. Raised in a region where snow fell throughout the entire year, Pyre developed footwork that imitated someone gliding across ice. From that experience, the 10 heavenly steps were born. Thanks to extraordinary effort, Pyre was as strong as Enix Glazer. However, Crash knew his feints, habits, and even his ultimate move because he had witnessed everything in his previous life. Garden remarked that by combining his knowledge of his opponent with his sixth sense, Crash had made any chance of Pyre winning practically impossible. Carefully, Crash brought the blade close to his opponent's neck and advised Pyre to become stronger, so that even when his hopes were shattered, he could still leave something important behind. In the end, however, Crash did not finish the duel with his sword, but with his 1-inch punch. Even after losing, Pyre said that he hoped to meet Crash again someday. In the original timeline, the two eventually became good companions. Crash knew very well that Pyre was a genuinely good person. Pyre promised to work even harder, especially because Crash had removed the curse from his body. In return, he swore that he would do everything he could to protect that world. It was the first time Crash had received sincere gratitude for what he did. He replied that he would certainly meet Pyre again at the academy. Sometime later, the second prince Chifonafania remarked to Ibelisk that the Nightcrow never disappointed. According to him, they only needed to use the Nightcrow to draw even more nobles to his side, then the throne would naturally fall into his hands. What he had not expected was the sudden intervention of the Black Dragon Knights. The order responsible for punishing criminals was now under the command of Mary Diana. She appeared carrying a decree ordering the arrest of Chifonafania, who was suspected of being involved in the murder of the fourth princess. Chiffon replied that he had no reason whatsoever to eliminate that idiot. Mary Diana, however, claimed claimed that they had found an order written by him in Crownot's hideout, instructing him to assassinate Cicely. Even in the face of the accusation, he kept insisting that he had never written that document. Eblesk looked visibly uncomfortable, clearly unsure of how to respond. That was when Sarah appeared behind Mary Diana and asked who had said she was dead. Soon afterward, Sarah and Cicely stood before her, both alive, making the entire situation even more absurd. The princess remarked that there was something highly suspicious about the situation, since Mary Diana had genuinely believed she was dead. Mary Diana, meanwhile, could no longer understand what the hell was happening. On the night Sarah supposedly died, she had been carrying out an order from Cicely because the princess's intuition told her something was wrong. Sarah went to investigate the royal spy they had hired and discovered that every agent infiltrating the imperial palace had betrayed their side. Even though Cicely had abandoned the struggle for the throne years earlier, she was still being treated as a target. That same night, however, Sarah's path was blocked by a crow that was actually guarded. Crash's crow spoke directly inside her mind and temporarily took control of her actions. Krim then ordered her to pretend to be dead. Unable to resist, Sarah took Mary Diana's strike directly to the heart. She survived only because of the crow's immortality power, and without it neither she nor her highness would be there at that moment. Cicely revealed that the woman beside her was the former vice-captain of the Yellow Dragons and ordered the arrest of the vice-captain of the Black Dragon Knights on suspicion of espionage. Mary Diana had initially been satisfied with how the plan was unfolding, but she could say nothing at that moment, since any word might worsen her situation even further. When the vice commander tried to resist, Sarah brought him down with a single powerful strike, leaving him practically unable to continue. Mary Diana could not understand how everything had reached that point. Her plan had been to have Eblesk eliminate Sarah and then use her body to attack Cicely. Even so, everyone was there as though nothing had happened. On top of that, the spies planted by Sigram and Mary Diana had been completely neutralized. The fourth princess had probably uncovered the entire conspiracy and ruined the plan. That was why Sigram had tried to eliminate her, exactly as Mary Diana had suspected. If Cicely remained alive, she would eventually become a threat. For that reason, Mary Diana pulled Ebelesk's heart from her bag. Using the curse to control her, she ordered Ebelesk to attack the fourth princess. Ebelesk did not know what to do, since at that moment she had no control over her own heart. Since Crash had not yet stolen that curse, she ended up awakening her power over the dead once again. Suddenly, Mary Diana realized that Ebelesk's heart had disappeared. Her plan to eliminate the fourth princess, frame the second prince, and maintain control over Ebelesk had failed. Ebelesk was free now. The dead rose but remained calm, showing that the Lancer's entire attempt had been useless. Realizing that everything had gone wrong, Mary Diana concluded that she would have to finish off the princess herself. She then activated her absolute speed and entered maximum acceleration, charging directly at Cicely. However, at the final instant, the very person who had been ruining all her plans appeared. Crash stepped in front of her and blocked the attack. Mary Diana could not understand how someone who was supposed to be dead had managed to stop her acceleration. Crash replied that, as always, her simplistic way of thinking had not changed in the slightest. Chiffon was still completely lost amid everything happening, but he seized the opportunity to order the arrest of Mary Diana and Diana. The two were now suspected of attempting to assassinate members of the imperial family. That was when Mary Diana realized the magnitude of her mistake, since she had completely exposed herself even though the plan had failed. Now she would have to rely on Sigram or Arthur to escape that situation, although she was not even certain they would appear. Cicely asked whether Crash was alright, and he replied that, in truth, he was not doing particularly well. His hands were trembling and injured. Even while using the black flames, Crash had barely managed to block that spear, showing that he was still far from reaching the master level. Cicely remarked that this was the result of facing the divine spear head-on. She still possessed a defensive necklace, and Crash knew the princess was well prepared. Even so, Crash replied that what mattered was that she was safe. Hearing that, Cicely became slightly flushed. Meanwhile, the prince ordered a thorough investigation to determine whether any other accomplices were still involved. Ebelesk used her power to sink into the ground and escape from there together with Crash. There was still much to do, so he simply told her not to worry and to be careful. Cicely wanted to thank him properly at the very least, but decided she would repay that debt when they met again at the academy. The two reappeared inside a carriage. Crash remarked that the displacement ability was genuinely useful, although its limitations only allowed them to travel relatively short distances. Ebelesk then handed Crash the golden dragon herb he had previously requested. Since everything was already over, Crash casually returned her heart, handing it back almost as if it were just another ordinary object. Ebelesk remarked that he was quite different from other corruptors, since she had assumed she would be enslaved as well. Crash then asked why she considered him a corruptor, and she pointed to those black flames. It was not a corruptor's power. Crash realized that the black flames had consumed the energy absorbed along with the immersion poison, so to an outside observer, it could genuinely appear to be corruption. That was precisely why Ebelesk had believed it. Crash realized that other corruptors might interpret him the same way in the future. Krim interrupted the conversation after receiving a message from an undead subordinate. Judging by its contents, something seemed to have happened to Crash's fiancée. Krim reported that a man known as the Killer Hound had invaded the Hardenhearts Mountains, and Bianca Herdenhortz, Crash's fiancée, had disappeared in that region. Crash immediately connected the dots. That ominous feeling he had experienced upon meeting the Killer Hound's disciple had not appeared without reason. Now everything made sense. Crash told Abelesk that his fiancée was in danger and that they would leave immediately for Harden Arts. The necromancer asked in surprise whether a corruptor truly had a fiancée. She remembered hearing that the youngest son of the Valheim family was betrothed to someone from the Jardenha family. Abelesk also remarked that she could hardly believe anyone would agree to marry the daughter of such a troublesome family. Crash then revealed that he was that very fiancé, making Abelesk realize far too late what she had just said. She was so shocked that she even dropped her own heart, asking whether he had been Crash Valheim all along. He replied that it hardly mattered anymore after everything she had said. Meanwhile, in the Hardenarts territory, Jenica Hardenarts cried inside a makeshift mountain camp, blaming herself for Bianca Herdenhortz's disappearance in that region. One of Krim's subordinates, the undead under his control beside her, asked why Bianca had gone up the mountain. Jenica explained that she had been searching for a rare fungus and decided to look for it alone. A few days earlier, Bianca Herdenhortz had set out for the mountain, with Jenica following behind her. She said she could personally retrieve the ingredient wanted by the Valheim, so Bianca would not need to go there herself. Bianca, however, immediately replied that Crash was no useless person. She also said that Jenica did not need to accompany her or mobilize her search party because of it. Jenica replied that it had been her own choice. Since they could search for the sun snow fungus another time, it would be better to return somewhere safe. Bianca said she understood that her sister had hated her since childhood because she believed their mother's death was her fault. She apologized and promised to return home as soon as she found the fungus. Jenica remembered that she had never wanted things to end that way and kept repeating that everything had been her fault. Then, unexpectedly, someone asked whether he could accompany them. A dark presence emerged, carrying an extremely threatening aura. The killer hound appeared before the search party, greeting the young women while swiftly taking down nearly everyone there. The few remaining members decided to hold him back for as long as possible so the two young women could escape. They ran into the forest to hide, but the traces left by the confrontation still revealed their path, and the killer hound continued searching for both of them. Jenica desperately insisted that they needed to flee, but Bianca had promised Crash that she would find the sun snow fungus. Jenica was already tired of hearing her sister talk about her fiancé. That was when they came up with an idea. Both were using movement artifacts, and unlike their pursuer, could cross the surface of the snow with ease. If they lured him toward the cliffs, they might be able to slow him down. Glacial Cliff was an area covered in enormous amounts of snow and thick ice. When he realized where they were heading, the killer hound admitted that the girls had thought things through. Even so, he believed he could find them no matter how hard they tried to escape. Upon reaching the edge of a cliff with her sister, Jenica realized there was no safe way out. Jenica apologized to her younger sister, but Bianca pointed to a rock formation below and suggested jumping. Jenica hesitated, but Bianca reminded her that staying there was also extremely dangerous. At that moment, the killer hound had already caught up with them and remarked that remaining there was quite risky. With no other choice, Bianca jumped while pulling her sister along with her. Even their pursuer was surprised by that decision. The killer hound jumped shortly afterward as well, planning to reach the same rock formation where he believed the two would land. Bianca, however, changed her trajectory in midair and moved directly toward their pursuer. With the impact, she managed to throw him off balance, and the two ended up plunging down the cliff. After returning to the camp, Jenica explained that this had been the last scene she managed to witness. The second search party reported that there was a very thick layer of snow exactly where Bianca had fallen. Because of that, there was still a possibility that she was alive, although the same could also be true of their pursuer. Maybe. Krim's subordinate claimed to be certain that Bianca Herdenhortz is being protected somewhere. But Jenica asked them to stop making those assumptions. It has already been a week since she fell, even if she managed to escape the assassin. Bianca Herdenhortz spends almost all her time reading books. Her body is not prepared to endure a situation like this. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the cliff, Bianca Herdenhortz endured hunger, thirst, and cold, but all she could think about was wanting to see Crash. She woke even weaker and realized that surviving for several days on nothing but nuts and the warmth of the solar snow fungi had pushed her body to its limit. At least her leg had already recovered. After falling from the cliff with the assassin, she kept searching for higher ground from which she could send a distress signal. Eventually, she found a garden filled with solar snow fungi. The place was warm and comfortable because, as their name suggested, those fungi naturally gave off heat. She took shelter in a seemingly unstable cave and kept warm near the fungi. Following the instructions from a survival book, she managed to tend to her injuries and find something to eat. However, between the cold, her injuries, and the lack of food, her strength was running out. The avalanche had probably delayed the search, but she had to endure because she had promised Crash she would return. Meanwhile, the assassin dog finally managed to track her down. She left the shelter because she needed to find something else to eat. At that moment, an axe flew dangerously close to her. The tree beside her toppled over, causing her to roll across the ground and fall. She ended up right in front of the assassin dog, who found the girl strange because her expression did not change even in the face of danger. He never imagined Valheim's fiancée would cause so much trouble. She could have returned home without much difficulty if she had cooperated. took her hair ornament. He could get a good price for selling it, but Bianca only wanted to return home to Valheim and the Blue Pine Mansion. She wanted to read her books while Crash trained and regain those peaceful days. If only she had understood her own emotions better, perhaps she would have realized how pleasant that life was and never would have left. She would never have come to this place. So once again, she called out for Crash. It was at that very moment that he appeared, wearing a threatening expression. Crash struck the assassin dog in the abdomen with a powerful 1-inch punch. He had managed to save his fiancée and told her that she had done very well until now. From that moment on, she should leave the rest to him. Then he asked Garden to take care of Bianca Herdenhortz. The immortal himself explained that he and Ibelisk could not interfere. Their servants were not strong enough for that battle, and Ibelisk was still afraid of the assassin dog. Crash replied that he already understood the situation. After all, she was the one who had teleported him to that place. Garden reminded him that during their previous encounter, he had escaped only by luck. He also warned Crash that the assassin dog was stronger than him. Even so, Crash was convinced that he would win. No matter how powerful that man was, he was determined to defeat him. Crash demanded that Bergman, the assassin, return the accessory that belonged to his fiancée. Only then did the man realize that this boy was the same brat from before. His axe collided with Crash's sword. Bergman was far faster, more aggressive, and more savage. Besides being powerful, he remarked that by taking Crash and his fiancée hostage, he might be able to double the reward. On second thought, perhaps he could receive 10 times as much. Meanwhile, Crash was beginning to struggle to keep up with the pace. Defending against every attack from the assassin dog was rapidly draining his strength. The cold made the situation even worse. After another impact from the axe, Crash fell to his knees. Carl declared that the game was over, but soon realized that the boy had disappeared into the snow. Suddenly, Crash appeared behind him and struck him again with his 1-inch punch. The impact struck the assassin dog hard and left him badly injured. Crash's blunt sword could not directly compete with the assassin dog's strength. However, he still possessed a far more powerful weapon. That was when he summoned Ignis, his sword wreathed in flames. However, he was met with Ghostly Bind, a technique capable of instilling fear directly into Crash's soul. The dog asked what he thought of that. The search party could arrive at any moment, so he intended to settle everything before they appeared. Crash felt intense fear when he realized that his senses were being distorted. The ability used by the dog was a secret technique that manipulated the perception of aura through sound. The old Crash would have been defeated almost immediately by it, but now he possessed the mind's eye. Because of that, he merely pretended to be disoriented and unable to coordinate his movements. Convinced that his blef was working, the dog charged forward with his axe. Even so, the dog already knew that Crash's movements were far from ordinary. Knowing that the effects of Ghostly Bind would not last long, he decided to end the confrontation quickly. Crash, however, countered the attack with his flaming sword. The dog admitted that Crash truly was a troublesome boy. He had already suspected that he was no ordinary prey, and that made the confrontation even more interesting. He tried to unsettle Crash with threats against him and his fiancée, but his words provoked no reaction. It seemed Crash could not even hear him. He appeared completely dizzy and confused, making the ghost dog believe that he had finally succeeded. Convinced that Ghostly Bind had worked, he summoned his ghost battle axe to end the confrontation. Even so, Crash continued blocking every one of his attacks. Ibelisk, still in the form of a small bird perched on Bianca Herdenhortz's head, warned that Crash would not survive much longer at that pace. She wondered whether she should help him. However, if she defeated the dog there, his master would become furious and would certainly seek revenge. Even so, despite living as a recluse, Ibelisk knew very well how to repay a debt. Garden, however, ordered her to wait and knocked her away with a slap. After all, Crash himself had chosen to resolve that situation alone. Garden asked them to trust the man who had recovered her heart. Crash possessed enough mental strength to see that confrontation through to the end. Ibelisk said that if he truly dies, he will resurrect his body rather than let it go to waste. After some time, Crash was already reaching his limit. He had been anticipating the killer dog's attacks by spreading his mind's eye across the entire area. However, his aura was nearly depleted, and the flames were beginning to fade. It was impossible to maintain that state any longer. He continued facing the phantom axes, but when he deflected one of them, he discovered that it was nothing more than an illusion. The killer dog lunged at him, aiming for his neck. At that moment, Crash finally understood the truth. He had long known his own limits. He was weak and had no talent. Unlike those geniuses, he would never be able to grow stronger in the same way. He knew he could never defeat someone with overwhelming strength head-on. For that reason, he had kept his true weapons hidden until that moment. Then, he forcibly activated Flame Breakthrough. Using Ignis's flames, Crash turned the corruption energy accumulated from the poison into fuel and forced his body beyond its limits. He burned his own human energy as fuel. However, that form could only be maintained for 3 seconds. The killer dog immediately realized that it posed a threat. He responded with an illusory scream, but Crash managed to land his attack. However, the strike did not hit the neck as he intended. It only struck the killer dog's shoulder. His mind's eye revealed the situation clearly. The effects of flame erosion were already fading. The killer dog's fangs were about to reach his head. Crash, however, sacrificed his own arm to escape. At the same time, he activated his ability. In that extreme state, guided by his sixth sense, he began to merge with the world itself. At that moment, he could sense sense everything around him all at once. In that brief interval between one breath and the next, the killer dog realized that he had already lost. And with his next strike, Crash finally made his opponent disappear. Even Garden was left completely speechless by what he had witnessed. Crash knew that the strong defeated their enemies without suffering even a scratch. For someone weak to surpass his limits, however, a far greater price had to be paid. He managed to end the battle. He lost his right arm in the process, but he had finally won. Garden then asked whether he was satisfied with that outcome. Crash replied that he was far from satisfied. Moments later, he collapsed face first into the snow. Shortly afterward, everyone returned home using the necromancer's teleportation ability. In the original timeline, Crash met Bianca Herdenhortz when they were both older. Bianca said that if she could express her emotions, perhaps her world would no longer seem so gray. Crash warned that in her current state, suddenly awakening her feelings could cause a fatal shock. Bianca Herdenhortz replied that it probably would not matter to him. After all, although they were engaged, the two of them were practically strangers. Crash agreed, explaining that the engagement had been decided unilaterally by his family. Dagrakan Hardenheart, head of the family, suddenly lost his mind one day. Tragedy struck everyone around him before he ultimately took his own life as well. Bianca Herdenhortz was the only survivor of that tragedy, thanks to the second daughter, Jenica, who managed to protect her. After the tragedy, House Valheim considered a marriage alliance. However, they unilaterally broke off the engagement between Crash and Bianca Herdenhortz, and that meeting had been arranged only so they could say goodbye. They were there only to exchange one final farewell. Crash said they would probably never meet again. Before leaving, he gave her a warning. If she gave up on living, he would not be there to help her. It was at that very moment that she transferred her curse to him and asked what he had felt. That day, Bianca Herdenhortz finally broke free for the first time in her life from the Snow Doll curse. According to Elra, when Bianca regained the emotions she had lost, she ultimately became a demon in the eyes of that world. 3 years later, war was ravaging the Hardenarts' territory. The prince possessed information capable of shaking the very foundations of the empire. To prevent that information from being revealed, the empire decided to send the Poison King. He was the one who drove the patriarch of the Hardenhearts insane and caused that tragedy, setting the accursed war in motion. Later, the White Phantom defeated the Poison King. Crash then stormed the castle, questioning the incompetence of Stallone's soldiers. They were responsible for the frontline supply depot, yet behaved with absurd negligence. The Empire's soldiers pursued Crash, who belonged to the Azuri generation. He realized that he had overused his curse so badly that not even a saint could heal him in that condition. With no other choice, he would have to seek Bianca Herdenhortz's help. So Crash knocked on the castle door, and she responded by unleashing a storm of countless ice needles at them. With that attack, all the Imperial soldiers were eliminated. Bianca remarked that it had been a long time since she had last seen Crash. Gravely wounded by the Poison King's daughter, she fell into his arms and asked whether he still remembered what they had discussed. She was referring to their old question about having emotions or living without them, asking which of the two caused greater suffering. On the day of the tragedy, her sister Jenica confessed that deep in her heart, she had never truly hated her younger sister. Jenica blamed herself for harboring resentment without reason. After all, Bianca was only a child who had never deserved such hatred. After that, Jenica hid Bianca Herdenhortz inside a chest. Since Bianca still had no emotions at the time, she could not understand the true meaning behind her sister's words. It was a complex and contradictory feeling. When the Hardenhearts collapsed, Bianca felt nothing. Now, after discovering the meaning of emotions, she finally understood those words. Her sister truly loved her. That day, she cried bitterly. If her emotions had awakened a little sooner, perhaps the two of them could have shared that sorrow as a true family. Perhaps everything could have ended differently. Perhaps Crash and Bianca might even have remained together as true fiancés. Crash awoke with those memories still vivid in his mind, calling Bianca Herdenhortz's name. Back in the present, Bianca held his hand and began to say that. At that moment, Garden remarked that he had finally awakened. Crash was at the Hardenhar residence. Still in severe pain, Crash asked why she had climbed the mountain alone. Without Krim's warning, he would not have arrived in time. Bianca Herdenhortz explained that she only wanted to deliver the sun snow fungus. Suddenly, Crash remembered something and handed her the hair accessory. She thanked him. Now he could finally prepare that elixir, the very one that Bianca Herdenhortz claimed she had no emotions. Even after everything he had done to save her, she still could not feel joy, anger, or even sadness. That was exactly what frustrated her so much. At times like this, she wanted to smile and cry like him, and share his anger whenever he was upset. However, she would hate to see his emotions disappear as well. If he could no longer smile, she would not be able to either. However, he told her not to worry, since the curse had far less effect on anyone who was not its true target. Then she asked him to recover his emotions. He replied that she did not even need to ask, and when he finally managed to free her from there, with tears filling her eyes, she ran over and embraced him. He remembered what she had said. If she could express her feelings, perhaps her world would no longer seem so gray. After crying for quite some time, leaving her nose red and her eyes swollen, she finally felt better. Sometime later, however, her expression became impassive again. She still had difficulty understanding and dealing with her own emotions. At that moment, Jenica knocked on the door because she wanted to speak with him. Jenica asked what had happened to Bianca Herdenhortz's eyes. Her brother wanted to invite her to lunch, and since Crash could still barely move, they brought his meal there. Crash noticed that Jenica barely even looked in his direction. Remembering the original timeline, Crash knew Jenica would apologize to Bianca Herdenhortz around this time. She then said that even if her sister changed her behavior, Bianca did not have to feel obligated to forgive her. If she did not like the change, she could simply ignore her. Once everything was over, they would return home together. Bianca Herdenhortz looked slightly embarrassed by those words. Then she gave a small smile and said she was happy. It was obvious that she still struggled to understand her own feelings. Crash then discreetly asked Ibelesk, hidden beneath the bed like a rat, to lend him her ears for a moment. He wanted to listen to the conversation with Bianca Herdenhortz. Ibelesk sent a small rat into the hall, while Crash warned that if they said anything inappropriate, he would make the entire place sink into the ground. Crash said Krim was in no position to worry about his fiancée. Without an arm, he would not be able to take his immortality in that condition. Even so, Crash asked him not to get so angry. An injury like that could surely be treated by a saintess from a holy land. They said there was a saintess in the holy land of Freeman, blessed with divine power granted by God, capable of even bringing someone back depending on the circumstances. Krim asked if he truly believed the Valheim house would spend a fortune treating someone useless like him. Crash replied that this was precisely why he intended to replace his right arm with a better one. Krim then asked if that was the real reason he had resurrected Ibelesk. Crash confirmed it. If Ibelesk were the one sewing a dead man's right arm onto him, it would practically be child's play. Krim remarked that he intended to exploit the poor girl to the limit. In his opinion, those regressors were all far too calculating. Every last one of them. Crash, however, thought that this time it had merely been a coincidence. After all, losing an arm had never been part of his plans. Krim asked who had mentioned that arm, since there was no way to repair it in that condition. Crash disagreed and revealed that he intended to obtain the sword demon's arm. Garden himself immediately asked whether he had obtained the remains. The Sword Demon was a legendary swordsman who had shaken the world. A master of quick draw, he defeated opponents before they could draw their weapons and had been Garden Crimson's most treasured subordinate. Garden immediately refused. That man was a true masterpiece, and he would never allow Crash to simply take his body. Crash remembered that Garden wanted to see him become stronger, so he suggested that Garden could raise him the same way he had raised the Sword Demon and asked what he thought. Garden replied that this was precisely why he had preferred that failure from the blind sword instead of him. Crash said he knew how much Garden valued his subordinates. At that moment, he realized that discovering the weakness of Garden's main body was actually quite simple. In the original timeline, Arthur discovered this weakness and told the Saintess that Garden saw the world through the eyes of his own subordinates. Because of that, he unknowingly formed bonds with them. With the Saintess beside him, Arthur could keep Garden's subordinates alive under pressure until Garden, unable to endure it any longer, finally surrendered. Back then, Crash thought that strategy was completely insane, but that was simply the kind of person Arthur tended to be. Crash then told Garden that the Sword Demon had passed away because of old age, but his legendary quick draw style still remained. He then asked whether Garden could truly see everything. If he transplanted the Sword Demon's arm onto himself, perhaps he could bring that legendary technique back. Garden replied that he needed 2 days. All Crash had to do was wait that long, and he would return. Looking at the arm he had lost, Crash concluded that this practically solved his problem. Now he only needed to find out how the Valheim house would react to the news that had been sent. He also needed to coordinate a consistent story with Hardenhearts about how he had lost that arm. Crash was also worried about Ariad. Although he had reported that he was at Piero Azul's mansion, sooner or later they would discover that he had actually left home. If it came to that, Crash could simply tell Ariad to mind his own business. It was not as though he cared that much about him, but he still felt that something was wrong. Meanwhile, during lunch, Bianca Herdenhortz declared that she rejected the proposal. However, Meryl Khan, the eldest son of the Hardenhearts, claimed he had already settled everything with the vassals. Bianca should hand the engagement over to Jenica since Crash Valheim's potential could make him essential to the family. Bianca Herdenhortz replied that she might be childish, but she would not easily abandon something she truly wanted. Therefore, she had no intention of giving up her position as his fiancée. Meryl Khan asked whether she could truly maintain that position. According to him, a cursed girl like Bianca would eventually be discarded once Crash lost interest. Jenica said he was going too far, but Meryl replied that he was merely stating the facts. If she felt so guilty, she could marry Crash and start thinking about the family. Bianca Herdenhortz asked what that family had ever done for her. She did not care what happened to that house because from the very beginning she had never felt that she belonged among the Hardenhearts. Neither her father nor her sister had ever truly cared about her, so she had already made her decision. Even if she were expelled from the family and lost everything, she would still marry Crash. Meryl Khan simply could not believe what he was hearing. That was when Crash himself appeared and interrupted the argument. He had overheard part of the conversation in the hallway and could not simply ignore it. Meryl Khan immediately adopted a gentle tone, saying that Crash was injured and must be tired. However, Crash replied that 2 rumors had been circulating lately. The first said that Crash Valheim had saved his fiancée and defeated the Killer Hound, even though he had lost his own arm during the confrontation. The second said that the family's security was so incompetent that they could not even stop the Killer Hound, allowing a direct descendant of the Valheim house to be seriously injured. With the patriarch absent, Crash asked whether Meryl Khan had already realized which of the 2 rumors sounded more convincing. Therefore, they should allow Bianca Herdenhorst to choose freely. Whether she wanted to keep the engagement or end it, the decision belonged to her alone. At that very moment, Bianca Herdenhorst had already rushed over to cling to her future husband. And Crash added one more thing. He had no intention of abandoning her either, and he was not the least bit worried about that curse. Meryl Khan replied that if he truly thought that way, there was no alternative but to leave everything in her brother-in-law's hands. But Crash still asked whether the priestess could restore his arm. The results would appear in 2 days, and if it worked, it would be great for her reputation. Meryl Khan asked what he was talking about. In the end, she decided to let it go and simply accept it for now. After the two left, Jenica told her brother that Bianca Herdenhorst had changed. She was even saying that she should marry Crash soon. 2 days later, at an open training ground of the Hardened Hearts, Crash needed to work twice as hard at his exercises, especially now that he could rely on only one arm. However, even so, he trained while trying to combine the Sword Demon's quick draw art with his own single strike skill. The technique required concentrating the extreme immersion poison and aura into a single point. With only one arm, doing that was extremely difficult. Even so, nothing had changed. He was still an idiot. Despite that, he felt relieved because the Snow Doll's curse had worked. The extreme immersion poison in his blood had been neutralized, allowing him to perceive the blind spot of flame erosion. That meant he could consume the world corruption absorbed by the extreme immersion poison together with Igni. That was how he activated flame erosion. The skill allowed him to forcibly break through his physical limiters, using his own body and world corruption as fuel. However, there was a consequence. The price was steep. As soon as the skill ended, he became completely incapacitated. The technique pushed the body's internal heat to its absolute limit. Because of that, he could not maintain it for long, as his organs could suffer severe damage. If he could control that heat better, he could extend the skill's duration. That was when he remembered someone who possessed a similar technique. That established his next objective, the dark lunar physique of the Flame Emperor Islan Rit. As soon as he recovered, Crash intended to claim that curse for himself as well. Later, Garden led him to Ibelisk's house, an enormous ancient tree with a door. There, he was greeted by number 8, one of Ibelisk's servants who looked after the house and had the appearance of a rabbit beast woman. Upon entering the tree, he remarked that the interior reminded him greatly of his past life. In truth, the place was surprisingly comfortable. Ibelisk informed him that all preparations for the transplant were complete. The sword demon's right arm lay on the table. She explained that she could implant it immediately and that the procedure was entirely feasible. However, it would be extremely painful. If he was afraid, she could simply knock him unconscious with a blow from a sledgehammer. Crash replied that there was no need. After all, he was already accustomed to enduring pain. Ibelisk told him not to start crying afterward. Then number 8 approached. She positioned Crash and the arm properly on the operating table. Then Ibelisk ordered her to hold him firmly. Using her necromantic power, she made the arm react and connected its nerves to Crash's. Soon afterward, the limb's regeneration and integration were complete. Only the final step remained, completely connecting the nerves. When all the connections formed at once, the boy nearly screamed from the pain. He only managed to hold it back because something was wedged in his mouth. Ibelisk admitted that she was impressed. In truth, she had not expected him to endure all of that without losing consciousness. When the arm finally integrated, Crash realized there was a reason he had been able to endure that pain without passing out. Then he began using the extreme immersion poison again. Immediately, the arm began to writhe, swelling and changing in appearance. The skin, nerves, and veins adapted completely. In the end, the new arm looked almost identical to the left one. It was as though that limb had never belonged to the sword demon. Crash felt as if the arm had always been his. Garden suggested that this was the perfect moment to immediately test the quick draw art. Crash asked Ibelisk for permission to use the training ground. She replied that she was not his servant and had no intention of obeying his every command. Then Garden asked whether she was still searching for the ancient book called Hakuban. Ibelisk immediately changed her attitude and began addressing him as Lord Krim. Naturally, she also allowed Crash to use the training ground. Number 8 led him there, while Garden pecked at his head and insisted that he start training already. After all, Crash still understood almost nothing about the quick draw art. Although it seemed similar to his swordsmanship, it was actually an entirely different technique. Normally, quick draw techniques accumulated aura while the sword remained sheathed, releasing it at the instant of the strike. However, the method used by the sword demon worked differently. He harnessed the accumulated aura and released it explosively with far greater efficiency. The tiny particles of aura dramatically increased acceleration. When the energy reached its limit inside the sheath, the blade was explosively launched outward. Crash could not fully understand the explanation, but he knew he would learn through practice. The countless strikes performed by the sword demon remained engraved in that arm's muscle memory. Garden also proved to be an excellent teacher. Now he possessed the sword demon's arm, and all the necessary conditions had been met. What remained depended solely on his determination. A few days later, Crash was still training at Ibelisk's house. Once again, he concentrated all the energy inside the sheath. Then he drew the sword, releasing the energy in an explosion. This time, he managed to surprise number 8. Even so, she was still able to follow the blade with her own eyes. The sword demon's technique was supposed to reach a speed impossible to follow. Yet number 8 could still see his movements. That showed that he needed much more training. His only option was to return to the Blue Pine Mansion and learn the next skill capable of making that technique even more powerful. Before leaving, he sincerely thanked number 8 for accompanying bullying him throughout his several days of training. She simply replied that he should have more confidence in himself. After all, someone with a single-digit rank like her possessed strength equivalent to that of a master-level fighter. Crash explained that the people he would need to protect in the future were also at that level. Even so, he thanked her for the compliment. That was when Obelisk finally appeared. Crash told her that he would return to Valheim that very day. If Obelisk went with him, she would be discovered immediately, so it would be better for her to remain at home. She agreed, saying that there really were many frightening people in Valheim. Crash assumed she meant the 5 elders, who would probably try to enslave her. Before leaving, he asked her to keep watch over the Poison King and prevent any action against the Hardened Hearts, especially to keep Patriarch Dagrakon safe. Obelisk asked whether he truly wanted her to face the Poison King, one of the 10 great sovereigns. It would not be easy, but to protect him, she might be able to find a solution. Crash thanked her and said that if she needed anything, she only had to ask. After he left, Obelisk thought that Crash had no idea what she might end up asking for in return. Number 8 was not entirely convinced about that mission either, but Obelisk remarked that under normal circumstances, she should have accompanied the boy. However, if she stayed by his side any longer, she felt that she would begin to see her former companions and cry. Besides, no one knew what kind of trouble she would end up in if she followed a Valheim. He would probably become an extremely dangerous invader in the future. For that reason, she decided it would be better to stay home and remain safe. Even so, if he ever got into trouble, she would certainly appear to repay the favor. When he finally returned home, he was greeted by Ariad. Crash arrived carrying a bundle, which was actually Bianca Herdenhortz wrapped in a sheet. Ariad explained that the main house had asked about him, so he reported that the young master was accompanying Miss Bianca Herdenhortz. Since the messenger often looked down on him as a failure, he had become careless when sending his reports to the main house. The main family suspected nothing and placed all the blame on the messenger. He was dismissed, and the situation was peaceful for the time being. Crash praised Ariad for handling everything so well and maintaining his usual efficiency. However, the butler warned him about another problem. The head butler would be coming to reevaluate him. Crash replied that this was already expected, now that he had drawn the family's attention. The head butler supervised all of Valheim's butlers and was the only person authorized to evaluate direct descendants. Her reports went to the Patriarch and determined how the heirs were treated, making that visit a serious problem. Even so, Crash needed the family's influence to take the shadow lunar physique from Aslan. For that reason, he already intended to use the opportunity to demonstrate his true strength. Ariad added that Darlene had left a message asking whether he should bring the materials as soon as Crash returned. Crash remarked that the man truly was impatient and thanked the butler for his excellent work. Even so, Ariad had one more piece of information. Miss Charlotte had returned and was currently staying in the young master's very own room. The moment she spotted her younger brother, she leaped from the building's balcony straight toward him. Charlotte complained that he had made her wait far too long and said she had nearly died from anxiety. Crash had simply assumed she would take a little longer to return. Charlotte then asked whether he truly wished that it happened. From the pressure of her gaze alone, Crash immediately realized that she had already surpassed the master level. Charlotte, however, was only teasing him. She then asked whether it was true that he had fought like a hero to save his own fiancée. When she approached intending to touch Bianca Herdenhortz's face, Crash instinctively stepped back. Charlotte assured him that she had no intention of stealing his wife, although she admitted that his reaction had hurt her feelings a little. He explained that he had merely been startled because she had entered his house without any warning. Charlotte then asked whether he was certain that the mansion could truly be called his house. She stomped hard and damaged part of the floor, reminding him that the mansion belonged to the Valheim family. Therefore, it was also her home, yet Crash still welcomed her that way. Crash thought she was exactly like their mother, getting irritated over the slightest thing. Charlotte remarked that the two of them had always been close, yet he had still hidden something so important from her. Forming a contract with a god and reaching the intermediate expert level were no small feats. He had certainly grown stronger, but Charlotte also sensed a dark presence within him. At the same time, Crash sensed something strange coming from her. Whatever Charlotte had awakened was definitely not the mind's eye. Her ability was closer to the stage known as the stellar eye, capable of seeing the world through the stars and even identifying the corruption within it. The illusions used by the assassin dog, for example, would never work against her. That meant Charlotte could clearly see Crash's current condition. Sometime earlier, Crash had asked Garden whether he could show his black flames to other people and how they would be perceived by anyone who saw them. Garden explained that to almost everyone, they would appear to be nothing more than ominous black flames. Only corruptors, their servants, or extremely rare humans could recognize the true power of corruption. Just as Crash could see the stellar mark on Garden's servants, certain outsiders could also perceive the nature of his power. However, Crash was different from necromancers who carried corruption within themselves. He merely mixed that power into his aura, something most people would never be able to identify. The problem was Charlotte. Crash could not lower his guard around her because if she realized that he controlled corruption, there was a chance she might genuinely try to eliminate him. Charlotte, however, merely approached and remarked that he truly possessed excellent equipment, displaying greed very similar to his own. She then told him to leave what he was carrying in his room and head to the training grounds. She wanted to personally test her little brother's abilities. Later, Crash was completely tense. He had never imagined he would end up facing Charlotte on that training ground, especially since she was at a level far above his own. Charlotte warned that she would get angry if he held back. Therefore, therefore, he should use all of his power. After all, she assumed her brother had learned a few new tricks. Despite his apprehension, Crash prepared for battle, gripping his sword while it was still inside its sheath. Charlotte noticed that 3 minutes had already passed, yet he had not even drawn his sword. Since she was the one who had proposed the duel, she found it strange that Crash would not take the initiative and asked why he still refused to attack. In the end, Charlotte decided to make the first move. That was exactly what Crash had been waiting for. He began consuming his own body as fuel while also gathering the power of corruption. He then combined the quick draw technique with his black flames, unleashing a powerful flaming strike capable of piercing almost any defense. Against Charlotte, however, it was not enough. She blocked the attack using only her aura, but Crash still had another 2 seconds available. Without wasting any time, he activated the Heavenly Sword. Charlotte also managed to stop that attack using only her aura, although the wooden sword she was holding snapped in half. Without her weapon, she immediately formed an aura sword and tried to use it to disarm her brother. It seemed that Crash had no options left, exactly as Charlotte expected. However, he used the black mantle to swallow the sword while it was still in the air and redirected it toward her, point first. With the strength he possessed at that moment, Crash knew he could not directly pierce her aura, but he still had another option. In the end, the blade managed to reach his sister's neck. Later, Charlotte admitted that it had truly been unexpected. Crash had managed to directly touch the aura flow protecting her. Aura flow was an exclusive power granted to her by the gods, forming an enormous current of energy that constantly surrounded her body and served as protection. It was a virtually absolute barrier. Neither weaker people nor someone at her own level could pierce it, and to think that Crash had been the first to accomplish such a feat. Of course, she had been holding back and avoided using any truly dangerous sword techniques. Even so, it was impressive. If that strike had landed cleanly, she could have been seriously injured. She told Ariad that she was worried about her brother's arm, but from the looks of things. She also explained that she had put him in his room because he passed out right after training. Then she informed the butler that only 3 weeks remained until enrollment. After all, he also intended to enter the academy. As his older sister, she would go first and wait for him there. A few days later, Crash was at Darlene Danfelian's alchemy workshop. At last, the elixir was ready. Garden remarked that the boy had impressive abilities and asked whether there was a training ground nearby where they could run some tests. That elixir needed to be consumed in a spacious area. Darlene replied that, fortunately, there was a perfect place for it, especially considering the type of medicine involved. Once at the training ground, Crash removed his shirt and prepared to meditate. Then he understood what Darlene had meant. Swallowing the pill was the easy part. The problem was Garden's malicious expression. It was obvious that he wanted to watch Crash suffer. Irritated, Crash demanded to know what the hell he had just swallowed. Darlene was surprised and wondered whether he had really taken it without even asking what it was. Garden explained that it was called the Weeping Dragon Pill. According to legend, one had to scream 9 times before finally transforming into a dragon. Just as muscles need to be strained in order to grow, that pill pushed the body and aura to their limits before strengthening them. Garden asked whether he was already accustomed to pain. If he could endure the pill's effects, he would become much stronger. Crash merely replied that he was beginning to feel heat building inside his body. The answer immediately silenced Garden's malicious laughter. Surprised, he asked whether Crash was feeling only a little heat. Crash explained that at first, it had felt as though he were inside a furnace. Now, however, only a tolerable warmth remained. He had already endured far worse. Garden wondered what kind of life that boy had lived. The answer would take more than an afternoon. Meanwhile, Darlene began to suspect that Crash was talking to the Raven because of a side effect of the elixir. Garden Crimson ended the conversation and told Crash to concentrate on absorbing as much of the elixir as possible. As soon as he began focusing his mind, even before he fully entered meditation, Garden noticed something frightening about Crash. His concentration was extraordinary, the kind possessed by someone who had endured extreme pain and continued moving forward. That was precisely what made Crash dangerous. Among all the returnees Garden had known, he was the most unusual. If he endured such pain solely to achieve his goal, then his determination was undeniable. Garden remained beside him to fulfill the promise he had made. He also focused his energy while Crash continued absorbing that power. Meanwhile, Crash surrendered himself completely to his body's reactions. His consciousness seemed to sink to the bottom of a lake. Until then, he had only been able to improve the quality of his aura with secret techniques from the Blue Pine Manor, and that method had its limits. His total amount of natural aura was also limited. However, after taking the Weeping Dragon Pill, Crash instantly advanced from the intermediate level to the rank of an advanced expert. When he finally emerged from that state, he was far more powerful. For the first time, he had reached the same level as those considered geniuses. When Crash awakened, Garden remarked on his stubbornness. He had used Ignis to burn away the impurities released by the pill, a remarkably clever decision. Crash replied that he needed to be stubborn. Otherwise, he would never stand a chance against his enemies, and Crimson was also included on that list. At that moment, Darlene appeared and asked whether they were finished. Bianca Herdenhortz was also growing restless and did not want to keep waiting like that. Bianca approached with obvious concern, asking whether she still needed to keep her distance for so long. Crash replied that from then on, she could wait comfortably somewhere nearby. Darlene remarked that having a fiancé seemed like a lot of fun. Maybe he should get engaged to Charlotte. But if Crash could have a fiancé, then he could find himself a boyfriend too. Irritated, Crash asked whether that idiot was looking for trouble. Turning serious, the alchemist asked whether Crash would enter the academy the following year. If so, he intended to enroll first just to force Crash to call him senior. Crash, however, realized that the future had changed. In the previous timeline, Darlene had not attended the same academy as Charlotte. He then asked whether Darlene knew that her academy did not have a traditional grading system. Darlene replied that he knew. There, anyone who failed the exams could not even advance to the next class. Even so, he was already preparing to enroll. After all, it would be the perfect opportunity to stay close to Crash and Charlotte. Crash had not even known that Charlotte also intended to enter the academy. He believed she was busy traveling the world and dealing with the effects of corruption. Darlene replied that it was only a hunch. For some reason, he felt that Charlotte would end up enrolling that year. He was excited to study alongside Crash the following year and asked him not to take too long. Soon afterward, Crash found himself trapped between the embraces of Bianca Herdenhortz and Darlene. Crash immediately told Darlene to move away and stop fooling around. Meanwhile, the head maid received word that Crash had returned to the Blue Pine Manor. She eagerly awaited the chance to evaluate him personally. She wanted to discover how much Crash had improved. That head maid was, in fact, also his great-aunt. Catherine Valheim arrived the very next day to conduct the evaluation. Crash had known beforehand that he would have to undergo that test. She explained that she had heard about his victory against the master-level killer dog and had come to personally confirm the true extent of his abilities. In short, if Crash could not reach at least Charlotte's level, he would have to abandon any ambition of becoming head of the family. When the destruction caused by corruption drew near, individual power would become far more valuable than mere family lineage. Even commoners could become emperors if they were strong enough. At that time, such a future seemed unimaginable, and Crash almost found it amusing to hear that prediction from his own aunt. Crash suppressed the urge to laugh and asked whether claiming the position of head of the Valheim family was truly so difficult. Catherine replied that the truly strong would always have a worthy place reserved for them. She then declared that the test could begin. Catherine grew even more satisfied. The Crash standing before her seemed completely different from the one she had seen a year earlier. As far as she could tell, he had already reached the expert level. Catherine explained the rule of the test. If Crash could force her, a master-level swordswoman, to retreat even a single step, he would pass. Crash immediately assumed the quick draw stance. Catherine recognized that stance. For some reason, it closely resembled the posture used by the sword demon. The scar on her neck, left by the sword demon, began to ache. For a moment, she wondered what it would be like if that person were still alive. Soon afterward, Catherine noticed that the aura emanating from Crash's sword was surprisingly pure and powerful. It truly made Crash resemble the sword demon more and more, and when he finally drew his sword, Catherine saw those flames emerging before her, black flames. Catherine admitted that it was not bad at all. She had no idea where Crash had learned a technique of that nature, and even so, Catherine managed to neutralize every attack using her own sword technique. The moment she did, however, Crash's sword shattered. Even though it was an old weapon, Catherine was surprised that it had broken like that. She said that he had passed the exam using only a single attack and congratulated him. Before leaving, however, Crash revealed that he wanted to join Valhalla's Seikai Knights. The order was currently staying at Halkran's Red Magic Tower. She asked whether he was certain, since Seikai was considered only a mid-tier knight order. Crash confirmed without hesitation. His expression made it clear that the decision had already been made. She replied that she would consult the knight commander and, after saying that, left the area. As soon as she left, Crash collapsed onto his back in the training field. However, he was soon surprised by someone's arrival. It was Balrog Valheim, the Marshal Emperor and head of the Valheim family. Besides being extremely intimidating, he even had the same protagonist hairstyle as Crash, making it obvious who his son had inherited it from. The old man's presence was suffocating. Crash could already barely move, and in front of him, he became even more terrified. Balrog merely said that his son had grown and told him to rest well. He had come only to say that, and, while the servants greeted him, announced that they would return to the Forbidden Territory. 3 weeks later, they arrived in Halgrim, the free city belonging to the Red Magic Tower. Crash, his fiancée, and Garden looked down over the city from above. Bianca Herdenhortz commented on the strange products being sold, and Crash replied that mages were eccentric and that everyone there believed in the supremacy of magic. Bianca had already read about that. It was precisely because the Flame King, one of the 10 strongest, resided there that the Red Magic Tower had become the greatest magic tower. Crash knew that the most dangerous regressor also lived there. Among the 3 who inherited memories, Bella, the Red Witch, reached the pinnacle the fastest and would soon regain her level as a Grand Mage. Because of that, he needed to prevent Bella from discovering that he was also a regressor. As soon as they finished their business, he intended to leave immediately. Later, the group entered an inconspicuous shop with no sign at all, completely hidden among the other establishments. Naturally, Crash had not gone there merely to eat. His true objective was Lilina, Aslan's maid from the Grit family. She always came there to collect her master's meal, because Aslan refused to eat food from anywhere else. After receiving the order, Lilina left cheerfully to bring the meal to her master, Aslan. Garden began following her discreetly, exactly as Crash had requested. Meanwhile, Crash decided to take the opportunity to eat something. When they finished their meal, Bianca Herdenhorst left the place quite satisfied with what she had eaten. Garden returned complaining that they were traitors for eating without him. Then he reported that he had completed his investigation and discovered a major problem. According to him, Aslan Grit, grandson of the Flame Emperor, had tried to take his own life. In truth, it had only been an attempt. The servants managed to stop him at the last moment, but it was clear that Aslan no longer wished to keep living. The next morning, Lilina appeared feeding a crow that was actually Garden in disguise. As she gave him food, she vented about the entire situation, saying that she no longer knew what to do. 2 weeks earlier, Aslan had tried to consume poison. The following week, he made another attempt, and since then, he had practically stopped eating. If that continued, his life would truly be in danger. Even so, Lilina insisted that her master was not a weak person. That was when Crash appeared and offered to help. At the same time, he realized why that crow seemed to have grown so fat lately. After all, Lilina was the one who had been feeding Garden. Crash then introduced himself as the youngest son of the Valheim family. Lilina asked why someone from such a prestigious family would be listening to the worries of a simple maid. Crash explained that he had only overheard by chance and believed that he might be able to help her. He then told her that he knew why Aslan had lost the will to live. Everything was connected to the disappearance of Dorothy, a student from the Magic Academy. Crash should not have known that secret, which was restricted to those close to the Wygrit family. Even so, he explained that concealing the disappearance of an ordinary girl suggested something greater, because corrupted creatures were learning and evolving. That was why the forbidden areas continued to grow. The Spirit King's forest had also evolved and created Dorothy, a spirit nearly indistinguishable from a human being. That was her true identity. Lilina understood why the Vice Chief had hidden Dorothy's existence, but she still asked why Crash was telling all of that to a simple maid. He pointed out that she went to that dining hall every day to fetch food for Aslan, and that, even when no one was watching, she remained genuinely worried about her master. Because of that, Crash believed that someone like Lilina could help him save Aslan, even if the young man himself might not realize it. In truth, Crash had once been saved by Aslan. He was referring to his previous life, although Lilina had no way of knowing that. Wanting to repay that favor, Crash decided to help Lord Aslan and asked permission to visit him. He also promised that within a few days, he would bring Dorothy back from the Spirit King's forest. Spirits were corrupted creatures born in natural environments. One of the main examples was the Spirit King's forest, a forbidden area located on the outskirts of Raoul. Halgrim's Red Magic Tower and the Wygrit family, led by the Flame Emperor, served as a massive barrier against the forest's constant advance. Later, Garden once again used Sephir's body, his supposed identity as an investigator. With the badge belonging to her, the group would be able to enter the forest without much difficulty. Crash explained that he was being watched by the main family and had said that he would join the Seikai Knights in Halgrim. Garden then handed him the 4th class investigator badge, complaining about yet another problem. As expected, they managed to pass through easily using the badge. Even so, the guards warned them to be careful, because the spirit's luminous dust was more concentrated that day. Saphira suggested that they turn back. Crash replied that something had seemed strange since the previous day and that Garden had been acting differently. Then he finally explained that a very long time ago, a subordinate of the Wygrit family brought a spirit out of that forest, and the two began traveling the world together. Crash immediately asked whether that was not the famous story of the first Spirit Master and the Chaos Spirit. The instant he finished speaking, a presence appeared behind him and asked about Agni, the Chaos Spirit. When the first Spirit Master left this world, the spirit, unable to understand death, believed that it had been abandoned. Consumed by loneliness, it lost control and devastated an entire city in a single night. The Wygrit family had to take responsibility for the disaster. Since then, contracts with spirits had been forbidden, and those creatures came to be treated as threats that had to be eliminated. Garden explained that the spirit wanted to return to the forest and recover its original form, but it had lost its reason, leaving only its aggressive instincts behind. The Chaos Spirit kept repeatedly screaming Agni's name. Garden then offered to deal with that creature personally. Crash said that would not be necessary. With a simple slash wrapped in flames, he revealed that he had already defeated the Chaos Spirit in his previous life and thanked Garden for bringing him there. Using his sixth sense, Crash dodged every viscous projectile launched by the spirit. Before the regression, he had struggled because only skill-based attacks could affect that creature. This time, however, Crash possessed one of the most offensively powerful abilities of all. He concentrated his aura and waited until the creature charged forward with its own body, leaving an opening in its defense. Crash seized the opportunity and counterattacked immediately. His quick draw pierced through the Chaos Spirit in a single motion. The result was weaker than he had imagined, but it was still enough for what he intended to do. Thanks to its extraordinary regeneration, the spirit could recover. However, Crash used Black Cloak to absorb that ability before it could happen. Then, he destroyed his own spiritual core. That way, he would now be able to absorb all the power of corruption. He also told Garden that this would be their final farewell. The little spirit of chaos returned to its peaceful state, once again looking like a small child. In truth, the spirit spirit only wanted to speak with Agni one more time. That was why she had waited all this time. After all, she believed Agni would never abandon her, and it was precisely at that moment, using Agni's body, Garden wrapped the spirit of chaos in an embrace. During their farewell, he asked for forgiveness. He realized that instead of merely watching, he should have intervened to help his subordinate. After all, he was merely someone who saw the world through them. Even after so much time, he still could not forget Agni's presence. Instead of worrying only about his subordinate with a limited lifespan, he should have taken better care of her. That was probably what Agni had wanted, and he should have sought help from others. Then, he sincerely apologized for taking so long to understand that. Only after doing so could he finally bid farewell to the spirit of chaos. Later, Lilina asked whether the crow had lost weight. Could it be that Crash was not feeding the poor animal properly? He replied that the Valheim never skimped on food. Taking advantage of the conversation, he asked whether she could find Lord Aslan. Crash had found a way to locate Dorothy, although the method was still incomplete. To bring her back, he would need her help as well as the Blue Lords. Lilina gave him an artifact capable of bypassing the mansion's magical defenses. With it, Crash climbed the building and entered through a window. As soon as he saw him, Aslan asked whether he had come because of Dorothy. Although he was quite startled by the sudden intrusion, Crash confirmed that he had. He truly wanted to see her. Crash asked whether he would still do it even knowing he would have to sacrifice everything he possessed. Aslan replied that he was willing to do anything. With that, they reached an agreement. Aslan would surrender his dark lunar physique and promised to sacrifice himself in the spiritual forest within a few days. In return, Crash would bring Dorothy back to life. To Aslan, it sounded almost like a contract offered by a demon. Crash complained that calling him a demon was extremely rude. If he truly were one, he would already have done something far worse to him. Aslan said that Crash was the one who made no sense. He already intended to die, so the conditions seemed far too easy. Then he asked whether Crash even knew what the Lunarson physique was. Crash replied that he did. It was a cursed constitution born from the moon's yin energy, forcing its bearer to spend their life surrounded by cold and shadows. Aslan explained that he could only move normally at night when yin energy was strong. Because that force eroded his body, his limbs remained constantly frail and weakened. For the Wygrit family, which specialized in mastering the yang energy of fire, that condition was practically fatal. At the same time, the dark lunar physique was the perfect material for surpassing certain limits. Crash then explained that this was precisely why he wanted to make a contract with Aslan. Since both were considered the black sheep of their families, he believed they could understand each other well. In the end, Aslan accepted and formed the contract with him. Aslan Grit was born into a bloodline famous for its masters of fire magic. However, because of his physique, he was unable to use that kind of magic. For that reason, he was removed from the list of possible successors and grew up without receiving genuine affection from his family. Agatha Grit, Aslan's mother, even protested against that decision. However, the family head replied that he could not favor his grandson simply because he was his descendant. According to him, none of this would have happened if Agatha had not married someone who possessed strong yin energy. The family head also mentioned a girl named Abella, who was exceptionally talented in fire magic. If Agatha did not intend to have another child, she should consider adopting that girl as her heir. He said all of this in front of Aslan himself, who merely listened in silence while trembling. Even so, Aslan later sought out his mother and promised that he would devote himself even more to his magical training. He wanted to become strong enough for his grandfather to look at the two of them again. Agatha replied that effort alone would not be enough. Aslan's father had been killed by the family head. If he wanted to survive, from then on he would have to treat everything as a fight for his own life. From that day onward, Agatha, who was then acting head of the family, began treating her beloved son with extreme harshness. She did so to prevent Aslan from being eliminated by the family as well. Crash only learned this entire story because, once during a conversation by the campfire, he asked Aslan how his body had ended up in that condition. Aslan lived covered in bandages because of his burns. He said that his grandfather, obsessed with the family and revenge against the Flame King, had forced him to destroy his own body. After trying to eliminate the dark lunar physique along with his own body, Aslan left the family. Later, he became the Flame Emperor and ultimately surpassed even his grandfather. For Crash to take his ability, he first needed to change Aslan's obsession. He had to overcome the dark lunar physique through his own strength rather than relying on someone else's power. It was practically the same condition as before, and, as always, Aslan remained extremely stubborn. Holding the orb Crash had brought, Aslan said that not even the Wygrit family, which managed the forest, knew of a method to bring spirits back. Aslan said he understood the plan and promised to tell Lilina everything. He asked whether handing over his physique would be enough, but Crash explained that he still could not receive it. He would only do so once Aslan was truly ready. Even so, Aslan trusted that Crash would be able to put that plan into action. When they left the tower, Garden asked why Crash had chosen such a complicated path. Was it simply because Aslan had been an old acquaintance in his previous life? Crash replied that he simply would not be able to stop the destruction of the world on his own. In the original timeline, Aslan tried to eliminate his dark lunar physique and ended up dying at the age of 24 after consuming his own lifespan. That happened before the worst scenario had even begun. Aslan was one of the great talents of the Azuri generation, wasted far too early. This time, however, Crash would make everything unfold differently. While confronting the disaster, Crash needed Aslan to stay alive and fulfill his role, helping prevent the tragedy. He did not want to simply use people the way Arthur did. Aslan was someone Crash could talk to and had already possessed tremendous talent before the regression. In addition, Crash needed the dark lunar physique. For that reason, this seemed like the best possible plan. Once, Lilina told Crash that by using his curse-stealing ability, he might be able to understand Aslan's true feelings. After all, the two of them practically had no friends but each other. Crash replied that this time, he would be able to keep that promise. He also assured her that he would fight alongside Aslan. The next day, Aslan's grandfather was trying to burn him with his magic. Agatha asked him to calm down, warning that the boy could die if this continued. However, the grandfather struck his own daughter and replied that Aslan had entered that forest fully prepared to burn himself away to the very end. He reprimanded Aslan for trying to end his own life despite being a direct descendant of the family. But no matter how hard Aslan tried, his grandfather never acknowledged him. Now at last, he was looking at him. Aslan said he no longer cared about the family's honor. He asked whether Abella would become the successor anyway, and revealed that he had gone out looking for her. Under the excuse of protecting the family, they had taken his mother and Dorothy from him. He declared that he would not allow everything to end that way. If his end was inevitable, then he would drag the family's reputation down with him. Faced with those words, his grandfather decided to finish Aslan right there. However, at the last instant, someone managed to interrupt the powerful fire spell cast by the patriarch of the Wigrit family. Crash then quickly pulled Aslan away, throwing him toward Lilina so she could catch him. Lilina pulled her young master aside and explained that she was carrying a letter from Crash in her pocket, along with Dorothy's crystal. In the message, Crash had left detailed instructions explaining where Aslan should use the crystal to reunite with his friend. The maid remarked that even so, in order to steal Dorothy's crystal, they had needed to lure the acting head away. No one had expected the true head of the family to return on that exact day. Because of that, it was only natural that everyone was worried about Crash. After all, he had stayed behind specifically to face that old man. Aslan said that he still did not understand why Crash wanted the Shadow Lunar physique so badly. Then, if he truly needed that ability, he could receive it right then. After all, the condition had already been fulfilled. From that point onward, Crash could finally use Aslan's black mantle. The moment he absorbed that power, his strength increased dramatically. When Patriarch Wig realized who stood before him, he became even more surprised upon recognizing the supposed failure of the Valheim family. First, because Crash possessed unexpectedly great strength. Second, because that boy was Aslan's friend. The old man was shocked, both by the energy emanating from Crash and by the discovery that Aslan had actually managed to make a friend. The energy surrounding Crash felt threatening. It was an enormous amount of compressed curse energy. The patriarch then remarked that apparently, Aslan did not have much talent for choosing his friends. He then simply walked past Crash and said he was far too busy with his own grandson. He told the boy to leave since he had no desire to waste time fighting a child. Crash, however, walked straight through the flames surrounding the old man and mocked him, saying that someone ranked among the 10 strongest should not turn his back on a mere novice. The head of the Grit family replied that both Crash and Aslan would only learn after being taught a proper lesson. Meanwhile, in the distance, Aslan was entering the spirit forest. That was when everyone heard and saw the massive explosion that marked the beginning of the confrontation. Lilina, however, told Aslan to ignore it and stay focused. The priority was summoning Dorothy. He followed every instruction Corvo had written in the letter exactly. No matter how many spells Aslan studied, he had simply never been able to use fire magic. To his family, that made him a shameful failure. But whenever he stood before Dorothy, Aslan was able to feel different. Whenever Dorothy summoned small water familiars, she would say that he was incredible. Perhaps that was some kind of... Aslan would reply that there was nothing special about it. After all, practically any student at the academy could do the same. Dorothy would say that she herself could not, and that at the academy she was considered a failure. She even offered him a grimoire, hoping Aslan could teach her. As payment for the lessons, she promised to bring food from her favorite restaurant. For Aslan, who believed that a mage incapable of using magic had no value, that was unexpected. Precisely because he thought that way, Dorothy seemed like a mysterious presence to him. After quite some time and with Aslan's help, she finally managed to use a little magic. Dorothy learned because she found it fun. For Aslan, magic had never been that simple. He studied because it was expected of him as the son of a prestigious family of mages. Dorothy remarked that perhaps magic simply seemed too difficult. Children were honest and rarely managed to truly devote themselves to something they did not want to do. Aslan then remembered when he used to love magic because of his mother's grandmother's influence. Back then, she would embrace him, tell him everything was fine, and he studied because he wanted to and because he enjoyed it. As a child, he had genuinely loved it. Thanks to Dorothy's words, he ended up rediscovering the joy he once felt for magic. After some time, Aslan finally confessed his feelings to Dorothy. He kissed her first and only afterward admitted that he liked her. He truly had reversed the order a little. Dorothy became the person who gave Aslan a genuine reason to keep living. However, on the day of the attack on the city, all the blame ended up falling on her. Her spiritual form was destroyed, causing Dorothy to return to the state of a mere crystal. She was accused of taking part in the attack, but Aslan tried to explain that Dorothy had actually been trying to help. When an illegal spiritual research society attacked the academy, Dorothy helped evacuate the students and tried to contain the fire. Even so, everyone condemned Aslan for defending a spirit. For someone from the Wigrit family, speaking such words was considered unacceptable. But Dorothy remained the person Aslan loved most. Meanwhile, the old man seemed to be enjoying his fight with Crash, saying that the Valheim novice had surely received the blessing of some god. In terms of speed, Crash was already close to the master class. The patriarch admitted that it was not bad at all, but decided to increase the intensity of the confrontation even further. At that moment, however, an enormous pillar of light pierced the sky. The spirit had returned. Crash had finally managed to buy the necessary time. The penalty that corrupted his body after 3 seconds had been neutralized thanks to the lunar physique. Now, Crash could maintain his strength during battle for much longer. In addition, he could still compress all that power and release it again for 3 seconds. In that state, his strength reached an entirely different level. The heat was intense, but Crash was still able to endure it. Even the head of the Wigrit family was surprised when he witnessed it. Crash's body was being pushed far beyond its own limits. Finally, he activated the second form of flame erosion, the flaming heavenly sword. Crash's black flames then collided directly with the fire of the head of the Wigrit family. The attack managed to pierce the defensive barrier created by the old man. However, in the next moment, Crash's sword ended up breaking. The family leader then asked whether Crash was truly Aslan's friend. Already exhausted after using that form for only 3 seconds, Crash confirmed it. He said he was Aslan's friend and probably knew him even better than he would have liked. The head of the family realized at that moment that Crash would certainly become someone important, a person whose name would be known by many. If Aslan remained beside someone like that, perhaps one day he too could become a source of pride for the Wigrit family. However, before the patriarch had the chance to say anything, an enormous wall of ice suddenly appeared between the two of them. Aslan appeared and said that it seemed they had provoked a high-level spirit. Because of that, everyone in that place was in danger. His grandfather warned that many people could lose their lives if the castle ended up collapsing. Crash, however, told the Flame King, Adolf Wigrit, that he would leave that high-level spirit to him. After all, it was now the patriarch's responsibility. And while they quickly fled from there, the old man could only grumble about that damned boy. After leaving the teleportation point, Garden reprimanded Crash for his recklessness, saying he stood no chance against one of the 10 strongest people in the world. Crash replied that opportunities like this were far too rare to waste. Aslan approached and sincerely thanked him, promising to repay the favor. Now that the dark lunar physique had disappeared, he intended to resume practicing his family's fire magic. Crash asked whether he would really choose the more difficult path, even knowing the patriarch would probably refuse to accept it. Besides, Dorothy was now by his side, but Aslan wanted to discover his own limits. Crash then told him to listen carefully. The following year, he should enter Harherd Academy, where he could temporarily distance himself from his family problems and gain more time. That period would be exactly what he needed to protect Dorothy and discover which path he truly wanted to follow. And once they were at the academy, Crash could help him as well. After all, the two of them were friends. Aslan admitted that it was indeed excellent advice. When it was time to leave, Lilina accompanied Crash. She did not want to interfere with the others' happy reunion. Lilina also thanked him deeply for saving young Master Aslan. She said she would never forget what Crash had done for the family and promised to repay that debt of gratitude. Thinking about what had happened before his regression, Crash felt that this was the least he could do. When he returned to his quarters, Crash found Bianca Herdenhortz feeding him directly by hand. Garden remarked that Crash had pushed himself too hard and had even destroyed his sword. It was time to obtain a better weapon, one capable of enduring flame erosion. He also had a suggestion. There was a place extremely famous for crafting weapons. Crash, however, already knew perfectly well where his next destination would be. It was Mazi Palace, created by the engineers of the ancient Parsuntrium civilization to produce weapons capable of rivaling the world's corruption. The enormous mechanical palace was built over an entire lifetime alongside a dwarf known as Devourer. It extracted and processed underground resources on its own, allowing Mazi Palace to produce countless treasures. The place attracted adventurers from all over the world, and the palace's byproducts had made the city of Lavara prosper. The deeper one descended, the rarer and more valuable the treasures became. Because of that, many explorers formed teams to take on the challenge. Even so, no one could get past the 8th floor because of a ghost. His name was Rakuten, the former leader of the Black Lions and admired by many. Thanks to the palace's power, he could not die and remained on the 8th floor wielding the legendary Emoshi. In the original timeline, Bellican was lucky enough to find that sword, but ended up losing his life after entering the forbidden area where Charlotte was. This time, however, Crash intended to defeat Rakuten personally and claim the sword with his own hands. Before regressing, Crash spent an entire year in Mazi Palace alongside Enix Glazer's group. They had gone there in search of legendary items as powerful as Bellican's sword. In the end, however, they found only that man who called himself a ghost and who was actually far weaker than they had imagined. Enix Glazer enjoyed provoking and tormenting that man, saying Crash was far too kind for showing compassion. To him, Fendel, the self-proclaimed guardian of the path, was nothing more than an insignificant nobody. And in the present, Crash was indeed being blocked by Fendel's group. The Fendel faction had no intention of letting him pass merely because he belonged to the Valheim family. Crash realized that nothing had changed from the previous timeline. Fendel was still someone who caused trouble wherever he went. He warned Fendel that it would still be better to apologize while he remained patient, because he hated anyone trying to block his path. Fendel said he was close to becoming a master and that Crash would not be able to defeat him there. Crash replied that this was at least something, and that he might even recommend him to the Valheim Order of Knights. Despite being a commoner, Fendel was skilled and close to master level. Crash pretended to take an interest in his potential and asked whether he wanted to become a Valheim Knight, an idea that immediately appealed to Fendel. Crash added that his little group could even be turned into a proper squad. They could call it the Stray Dog Squad, since they made as much noise as barking dogs. Fendel could hardly believe what he had just heard. Crash remarked that the moment Fendel saw even the slightest chance to rise in status, he became arrogant, but advised him not to forget his true position. Fendel replied that if Crash truly intended to clear the 8th floor, he would be better off not making an enemy of him. Crash retorted that if he defeated Fendel there, everyone he had oppressed would probably join Crash's group immediately, and Fendel knew that very well. The crowd quickly made room for the duel. Fendel accused Crash of growing up surrounded by privilege and vowed to defeat him, but feared retaliation from the Valheim family. Crash assured him that his family would not interfere because he would not lose. Before anyone could even officially announce the start of the duel, Fendel rushed forward at high speed, trying to end the fight immediately. Crash reacted in time, drawing his sword and blocking the attack. It was a sword made of black iron, a rather expensive weapon, just as expected from someone of the Valheim family. Even so, Fendel remained convinced that he would win. In his opinion, Crash had merely been lucky to block the first strike. He charged again with his twin blades, trying to leave Crash with a lasting reminder of their confrontation. But once again, the attack was blocked, as though the young Valheim could predict every one of Fendel's movements. That finally began to surprise him. His surprise only grew when Crash advanced with his flaming sword. Fendel was then forced to resort to his own electrical power. The clash between the two had already attracted considerable attention from the people around them. A girl among the spectators remarked that someone needed tremendous experience to wield a weapon that way. Crash, however, knew practically every one of Fendel's tricks and attacks, thanks to the countless times he had tried to challenge Enix Glazer. There was no doubt that Fendel possessed impressive electrical power. Seeing him attack, several people in the crowd believed Crash would not be able to withstand it. Crash responded with flame erosion wrapped in his black flames. When Fendel left an opening in his defense, Crash kicked him in the face and knocked him down, leaving him injured. In front of the crowd, Crash announced that he would climb to the 8th floor and defeat Rakuten. He also said he was looking for allies and that anyone interested could join him. After seeing him defeat Fendel so easily, many spectators truly began to believe that Crash might be capable of defeating Rakuten. The girl who had watched the entire duel closely began wondering whether she herself was working as hard as that young man. As she watched Crash, she knew she trained diligently, but she still could not break through the barrier needed to reach master level. The girl named Alec was then approached by Derek. He asked whether she would sign up for the tower and remarked that he had a feeling that boy might be their last opportunity. Derek explained that after being defeated by Rakuten while he was in Icarus, Fendel became satisfied with having reached the 8th floor, created a faction with practically no purpose, and wasted the last 5 years. She added that Alec was completely different from that. While everyone else had already given up on defeating Rakuten, she continued training intensely every single day. She declared that she would never give up, even if that disaster continued blocking her path. The next day, Crash stood before the palace, observing his surroundings as he waited to see whether anyone would appear. He was waiting specifically for Lacradian. If Fendel represented the darkness of that palace, then she was undoubtedly its light. In the past, Lacradian had reached the master stage and competed against every challenger. However, she eventually abandoned swordsmanship and began selling fruit at the market. Garden asked whether he would simply let Fendel behave that way, since he seemed to be seeking revenge. In truth, Crash had been counting on exactly that reaction. After all, he wanted to steal his liner electric ability. The first condition was to awaken Fendel's jealousy, while the second required him to see Crash as something more than a mere rival. The third condition was to inherit his objective. Crash had already fulfilled the second condition before, but he would encounter Fendel many more times in Mazen Palace, so there was no reason to rush. Garden then asked whether he truly intended to enter the palace without a team. At that exact moment, Lacradian appeared. The so-called Light of Maze Palace had come specifically to ask for a place on Crash's team. Crash asked whether she was willing to become Fendel's enemy. enemy. Lacradian replied that she was, since both she and Fendel were merely cowards who had been defeated by Rakuten. She wanted to change who she was, so she decided to challenge the 8th floor once again. Crash immediately accepted, shook her hand, and told her that she was more than welcome on the team. 2 days later, everyone gathered in front of the palace to begin the exploration. Lacradian knew the structure of Mazay Palace extremely well and explained that the ground floor was merely a facade. The real challenge began on the underground levels. According to her, it would probably take them around a month to reach the 8th underground floor, since traps awaited them in nearly every area. The difficulty would increase as they advanced, but the group's more experienced members would do everything they could to guide everyone safely. Derek would be responsible for serving as the guide for Lacradian's team. Fenicelli would take on the role of the group's mage. Crash said that if Lacradian trusted them, there was no reason to doubt their abilities. He then introduced himself and stated that they would work together until they reached the 8th floor. The group soon realized that despite belonging to the noble Valheim family, Crash was surprisingly pleasant and never behaved arrogantly. Fenicelli would handle the group's recovery, while Derek would be responsible for the traps. At that moment, Garden approached and whispered that Fendel's faction had begun to move. They intended to compete with Crash to see who could reach the 8th floor first, and Fendel had gathered a rather large group. Crash remarked that some people truly did not change easily. Fendel was exactly as he remembered him from his previous life. As the group advanced deeper and deeper through the underground levels of Mazero Palace, Crash noticed something curious. Even though they were underground, the place had windows. Even so, he decided not to think too deeply about it. When they arrived before 2 enormous doors, Lacradian explained that the first underground floor began just beyond them. Fenicelli explained that monsters known as clock rabbits would appear on that level. Lacradian then decided to personally demonstrate her strength. At first glance, the creatures looked like nothing more than adorable rabbits carrying small clocks. However, they quickly revealed their true nature and charged as a group like predatory creatures. Lacradian eliminated the monsters with ease using her sword wrapped in light. Her movements were precise, powerful, and completely free of wasted motion. Unlike Fendel, Lacradian fought in a much more direct manner. Crash also wished to reach the master stage, so this was a perfect opportunity to carefully observe every one of her movements. Until then, Crash had raised his level using stolen abilities, elixirs, and secret arts. However, he understood that the master realm had to be achieved through his own effort, without relying on external resources. Even though he wanted to become stronger, he knew his fundamentals were still lacking. No matter how much he imitated geniuses, he would never truly master those things without building a proper foundation. Lacradian, however, was different. She had built her foundation through constant training until reaching the master level. If Crash could absorb some of that experience created through the effort of an ordinary person, perhaps he would finally have a better chance of surviving in that academy filled with true geniuses. For that reason, Crash approached her and asked for a favor. He wanted to train with Lacradian every day until they reached the 8th floor. Derek remarked that the idea seemed somewhat reckless, but Lacradian accepted without hesitation. Derek asked why she would agree to such a proposal at such an important moment. Lacradian replied that Crash carried in his eyes the same ambition to reach even greater heights that she herself possessed. Faced with a request made with such determination, she simply could not refuse. And so, the group continued their journey through the increasingly deeper levels of Mazay Palace. Meanwhile, however, someone was extremely irritated with Crash for entering that tower in search of precisely that. 1 month later, the group had already reached the 6th floor of Mazay Palace, where they were fighting enormous automata knights. Lacradian was so powerful that she could have conquered every level they had passed through up to that point entirely on her own. Because of that, Derek and Fenicelli had barely been given any opportunity to demonstrate their abilities. Crash and Lacradian, on the other hand, seemed far from exhausted and even enjoyed training together. Fenicelli remarked that the two had clearly become more enthusiastic since beginning those training sessions. Lacradian agreed, saying that Crash always showed tremendous enthusiasm whenever an opportunity to learn appeared. Crash replied that since his foundation was still lacking, he intended to learn everything he could by observing Lacradian. At that moment, Lacradian finally realized exactly what Crash had been doing during those training sessions. Normally, pride would prevent someone from behaving that way. Crash, however, showed no hesitation. To improve quickly and achieve his goal of becoming stronger, he was willing to abandon even his own pride. Lacradian realized that following Crash might also help her grow even further. Motivated by that thought, she asked why he wanted so badly to become stronger. Derek tried to change the subject by pointing out the path to the 7th floor, which was already just ahead, apparently wanting to escape the conversation. Crash, however, replied seriously that he wanted to prevent the destruction of that world using his own power. Derek began laughing, saying that Crash still had that childish side within him capable of imagining such grand things. Lacradian, however, immediately realized that Crash had not said it as a joke. His gaze was far too serious for that. From the beginning, Lacradian had noticed that Crash had sincere eyes, and she understood that he truly believed every word he had just spoken. Inspired by Crash's example, Lacradian declared that she would also do everything she could to continue growing stronger and stronger. Crash realized that he had managed to cheer her up and simply told her to keep doing her best. The other two members of the group soon noticed that a certain chemistry was beginning to form between them. Derek finally changed the subject and explained to Crash that from that point onward began the 7th floor, known as the Mechanical Labyrinth. Countless traps and mechanical monsters awaited them. Since the walls themselves changed position, it was extremely easy to get lost inside that labyrinth. Because of that, escaping depended just as much on luck as on excellent observational skills. Derek, however, was not a guide by chance. He assured them that he could lead everyone to the 8th floor without much difficulty. However, not long afterward, one of the walls suddenly closed and they ended up separated from the rest of the group. Lacradian apologized for the situation, saying that Fendel's faction had probably resorted to some underhanded trick. Meanwhile, Derek and Fenicelli were dealing with those responsible on the other side. Crash replied that there was no problem because the others could take care of themselves. Besides, he had already expected Fendel to try something on that floor and had prepared an alternative in case they were separated from the guide. Lacradian was surprised and asked how he could have predicted that. She also wanted to know how he intended to find a way out of there. Crash replied that he would simply use his own ability to navigate through the labyrinth. In exchange, he asked her to carry him because using that ability required an enormous amount of concentration. Sometime later, Lacradian was running with all her athletic strength while carrying Crash on her back. Crash gave directions without the slightest hesitation. He told her to turn right after 500 meters, then left at the next fork, practically resembling a navigation system. Lacradian noticed that the walls, which had previously been black, were beginning to take on a reddish hue. That indicated they were truly getting close to the exit. Crash continued along the correct path. Lacradian said that she wanted to talk to him once they got out, but he replied that he disliked that kind of opening because it usually meant trouble was coming. At that moment, Garden told both of them to immediately conceal every trace of their presence. Crash reacted at once, covering Lacradian's mouth and telling her to hide her presence as much as possible. As soon as they went still, part of the nearby wall was struck by a powerful explosion. The walls of Mazzi Palace were known to withstand even blows from an aura-coated sword. Even so, someone was forcing their way through them. It was the armed princess of the Tiger Clan, an invader from another world and also a corruptor. Crash recognized her irritated voice as she complained about having broken through so many walls. What he did not understand was why that weapons fanatic was inside Mazzi Palace. People with special abilities born from corruption were called world corruptors or otherworldly invaders. Some were peaceful like Ibellesk and Garden, but many posed an enormous danger, sometimes surpassing even the 10 strongest beings in that world. Garden panicked and asked what they were going to do. From his experience, that weapons fanatic was far beyond Crash's current capabilities, so fleeing would be the wisest choice. Crash also knew very well that the situation had become extremely complicated. At that moment, there was no better sword than a mepbosh that he could obtain. Besides, if his weapon could not withstand his strength from then on, he would never be able to fight at his full potential. A mepbosh, however, could become either the best or the worst sword in the world depending on who wielded it. In other words, if a weapon of that caliber fell into the hands of the sword sovereign, humanity could end up being defeated by the corruptors. Before the regression, Charlotte had only managed to surpass the sovereign thanks to Meboshi, one of the 10 great celestial swords. Arthur had never tried to take that sword because he intended to make Charlotte and the sword sovereign fight each other. In this life, however, Crash had no intention of treating her as a mere sacrifice. He did not see everything as a game of disposable pieces like Arthur did. He intended to deal with the corruptors one by one. Even so, Garden suggested that they give up on that sword for the time being. Crash ignored the suggestion and told Lacradian that they would continue onward to the 8th floor. Prim could not believe that decision. Even if they were unable to defeat the armed princess, they could still take a mepbosh and flee immediately. After all, she would probably hesitate to act against him out of fear of Balrog. To Krim, it seemed like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Crash, however, refused. Meanwhile, on the 8th floor near the carriage area, Fendel boasted about arriving before the others and told the girls that they would return there many times after he took Haku's sword. The assassins responsible for the operation then reported that they had successfully separated the Valheim youth from his group. Now, no one else should interfere. For Fendel's faction, all that remained was to locate Rakuten and defeat him. Soldric, the vice leader of Fendel's faction, did not care about being called a coward. His only goal was to prevent all of the leader's efforts up to that point from going to waste. Fendel always told the team that he could not accomplish anything great alone. However, if all the challengers joined forces, he believed they could overcome even that enormous wall called Rakuten. On that tragic day, Icarus, Fendel's former group, had been completely defeated. Their leader, Kilaron, fell before Rakuten, but left behind something even more important than his sword. He also left behind the dream of conquering that floor, and that determination continued to motivate the entire team. While Lacradian had remained trapped in the past, Fendel had chosen to move forward and inspire the others. Soldric knew that without those encouraging words, neither he nor many others would still be there. At that moment, the guide informed the leader that they were finally approaching the place where Rakuten was located. Fendel was already prepared for the confrontation, keeping his blade ready in his hands. He then declared to the entire team that this time, they would defeat Rakuten with their own strength. strength. However, the armed princess was already waiting there and remarked with interest that Fendel's sword did not look bad at all. Everyone immediately felt the same sensation. Intense fear swept over them as their instincts warned that they were facing an enormous threat. The first person to shout for everyone to run was quickly struck down by the tiger princess, making the magnitude of the threat painfully clear. She then charged directly at Fendel to take his sword. Even under pressure, he managed to block the first attack. Even so, his arms began trembling from the impact. That woman's strength was simply absurd. She remarked that the boy's instincts were fairly good, since he had allowed his companions to flee first. However, she stated that they would not be able to escape the shadows she had created. Against opponents of that level, her clone technique was more than sufficient. The armed princess also told Fendel that his companions had probably already been defeated by then. Fendel, however, noticed an opening precisely while she continued talking. He seized the opportunity to try to break through her blockade, activating his electrical power and preparing a risky gamble. If he poured all his energy into that single attack, he would be in no condition to face Rakuten afterward. Even so, he would at least have a chance to survive. Fendel then executed Thunderwolf Draw, and the strike landed directly on her neck. For an instant, he believed he had won. However, he received a counterattack to the same area and was severely injured. The princess remarked that his ability was decent and showed interest in the sword. According to her, that weapon could block the senses of everyone nearby except its own wielder. But Fendel had underestimated the princess. The wound on her neck vanished within seconds. Meanwhile, he had already run out of strength and was completely unable to react against her. Even so, Fendel offered his sword in exchange for his companions' lives. If they could survive, nothing else mattered. The princess, however, reminded him that she had already said they were all dead and charged at him. Fendel only regretted that he would never get to face Rakuten again. He wanted to avenge his former master and show his allies that they truly could succeed. However, everything seemed destined to end there. That was when a sphere of black fire suddenly struck the princess directly. She was knocked down as those persistent flames engulfed her body. Crash appeared and said that Lacration had gone to help his companions. He then asked why Fendel was making that face, since he was still the leader. He then called Fendel pathetic and told him to get out of there because he was in the way. As Crash had already warned him, he hated anyone who got in his way. After sparing Fendel, Crash turned all his attention toward the princess. Then, shortly afterward, she broke free from the flames and remarked that it had felt like nothing more than a warm bath. She also realized that this direct descendant of Valheim was after her sword. Crash, however, was shocked. Even after taking his flame erosion slash directly, she had suffered almost no damage. The princess wondered what kind of idiot would choose to face her alone. Even so, she admitted that Fendel would probably only get in Crash's way even if he stayed. She asked what he had done, since her damage reflection should have worked. Crash wanted to avoid a direct confrontation, but he could not simply ignore the situation. If Fendel died, Crash would lose the chance to steal his ability. Since he needed to gather powers before the world's destruction, he had to intervene, even though he knew he could not defeat the armed princess directly. He then told the armed princess, named Schwadelphia, that Amiiboshi would be his. He ordered her to give up and get out of his way. She was surprised that Crash knew her true name and asked whether that meant he was also a world corruptor. Perhaps that was exactly why her ability had failed. Crash had managed to deceive her completely. Schwadelphia began to suspect that another infiltrator was pretending to be a Valheim and asked for his true identity and whose weapon he had stolen. Crash replied that she had been meowing for far too long. For a kitten, she made far too much noise. He then raised his flame-wreathed sword. Schwadelphia immediately countered the attack by hurling several knives at him. Crash dodged every one of them, making the princess even more irritated. She then charged using her enormous arsenal, alternating between attacks with an axe, a long sword, and various other weapons. Schwadelphia was genuinely surprised when she realized that Crash could evade nearly all of her attacks. Moreover, he was no longer using as much corruption power as before. He was clearly still hiding part of his strength. She preferred to avoid any situation that might involve her with Marchel Emperor Balrog. For the same reason, she also did not want to reveal all her cards by fighting at full strength against an unknown opponent. Even so, something felt terribly wrong. Her instincts insisted that Crash had to be eliminated right there, regardless of the cost. As they fought and raced through the carriages, Crash noticed that, conveniently, only one final door remained in that section of the train. However, the time he had bought was running out. Belokin had been lucky, obtaining the weapon with almost no effort after accidentally discovering an essential detail about Mazet Palace's incredible self-repair ability. The palace interior was practically impossible to destroy permanently. Because of that, Schwadelphia would never imagine that the 8th floor setting corresponded to a real place. Belokin, however, had accidentally discovered a flaw. Crash then said he would reveal something quite interesting. For some reason, unlike the other floors, the carriages on the 8th floor could be destroyed by fire and would not regenerate afterward. Burned doors simply vanished from that space. And the last of those doors was right behind him. If the entire carriage were destroyed, Schwadelphia would be expelled and thrown into some distant field in the real world. Schwadelphia finally realized why Crash had spent all that time doing nothing but running, dodging, and spreading fire through the carriage. Then she asked how he dared to do that. Furious, she assumed her tigress form and charged forward to end the confrontation. confrontation. She hated being deceived. However, the instant Crash began concentrating his energy, Schwadelphia noticed something different. The corruption power emanating from Crash had reached a far higher level than before. Her instincts screamed that there was danger, but her pride would not allow her to forgive him. Crash then unleashed an enormous arc of black flames using the second form of flame erosion. The impact struck her and blasted her out of the carriage, driving her away from that space. Crash remarked that she had better have been sent very far away. If the two of them met again, he was certain she would try to finish him off. Even after surviving that confrontation, the danger was still far from over, and all of it had happened because of a single sword. From the very beginning, that matter had brought nothing but one problem after another. Crash burned the final door while thinking that he needed to become much stronger. Garden asked whether he had truly defeated the armed princess. Crash, however, immediately wanted to know what had happened to Lacradian. When he returned to the group, he found Lacradian helping the others tend to Fendel. Crash then asked what exactly had happened while he was away. Lacradian explained that Fendel had tried to protect her and ended up gravely injured by a clone. The clones disappeared when Crash expelled the princess from the carriage, but Fendel's condition remained serious. Crash was surprised and asked whether Fendel had truly saved Lacradian. Before the regression, Fendel had committed many cruel acts for his companions and treated human lives as disposable. To Crash, he was just another despicable man from Mizze Palace. Since he kept interfering with his plans in this life, Crash had assumed nothing had changed since before the regression. Realizing this, Crash noticed that at that moment, he was not so different from Arthur, treating other people as nothing more than useful pieces. Despite being badly injured and barely able to speak, Fendel asked why Crash was standing there with the expression of a frightened kitten. Crash ignored the provocation and asked again whether Fendel had truly saved Lacradian, even after she had hindered the group during their climb to the 8th floor. Fendel realized it when he let Lacradian guard his back for the first time in a long while. From the beginning, the two of them had never gotten along. Their personalities, fighting styles, and even their views on life were completely different. Precisely because they were so different, they could compensate for each other's weaknesses. As a team, they had faced dangerous situations together countless times. Even so, if Lacradian disappeared there, Fendel would be the only one left to keep the memory of Ocarus alive, and that simply did not feel right. Even someone like him decided that, at least once, he wanted to try saving another person. Meanwhile, Fendel's entire team was doing everything they could to keep him alive. Crash then offered the sword to Lacradian. Originally, he had only obtained that weapon because she herself had refused it. In truth, Leader Killoran had wanted Lacradian to be the one who inherited that weapon. Fendel apologized for causing trouble. If they had not defeated that monster, his entire faction would have been wiped out. He then thanked Crash and asked him to defeat Hakut. Crash, however, realized that he had made everything more complicated because of his own prejudice. He had judged Fendel without ever truly knowing him. Because he had regressed, he jumped to conclusions too quickly and ended up forgetting the determination Fendel had possessed at the beginning. Arthur had regressed countless times, yet even then he had never managed to save the world. Over time, he began seeing people as nothing more than tools. In the end, Arthur lost to Crash precisely because he underestimated him, calling him a failure who could only steal curses. That was why Crash decided to follow a completely different path from his. Even after learning through regression that people changed according to their actions, Crash realized that, without noticing, he had ended up repeating the same mistake as that other monster. Growing stronger by stealing abilities did not mean he would be able to save the world. To protect that irrational reality, he could not remain trapped by memories of his previous life. Crash told Fendel not to worry. Everyone would make it out alive, Rakuten would be defeated, and together they would reach the 9th floor. However, for Fendel, there was already no way to change his fate. In his final moments, he broke through his last restraints, allowing Crash to fulfill every necessary condition. Fendel realized that Crash still showed respect for someone like him, even in that situation. Crash promised that Fendel's strength would not be wasted in the face of the destruction that was approaching. After that, Fendel finally departed from this world. Sometime later, they finally reached the carriage of Rakuten, the ghost of Mizze Palace. Crash asked Lacradian whether she still remembered the plan. She confirmed that she did. Until he destroyed the carriage, her only task was to hold back the swordsman. Everything had been planned out. After losing Fendel, Crash spoke with the surviving faction members and obtained information about the area where Rakuten and his companion remained. The area was completely ruined. Since it lay in the deepest part of the 8th floor, the only way out was the door to the next level. The real problem, however, was Rakuten's regeneration. His body was sustained by the energy of Mizze Palace. Fendel had explained that Rakuten could recover instantly even from wounds that would normally be fatal. Crash also remembered something that had been said in the past, when Bellocan obtained Emoshi through Ignis. At that time, they had said that Rakuten began falling apart as soon as he fell from the carriage. Although he was nearly immortal, without the palace's energy he could not sustain his existence for long. In other words, all they had to do was separate him from Mizze Palace, and all that apparent immortality would disappear. Crash explained that he already had a plan. He and Lacradian would handle the fight, while the surviving members of Fendel's faction regrouped with Derek and Fenicelli on the upper floor. Saldric thanked him and asked Lord Crash to ensure Rakuten's final defeat. With everything decided, Crash finally set the plan in motion. He intensified the flames surrounding his sword even further. Rakuten also drew his weapon, which originally had no physical blade. Instead, its blade was formed entirely from condensed lightning. Ibushi shone with an astonishing golden light. Crash could barely imagine the danger if that sword ever fell into the hands of the sword sovereign. Emoshi transformed the user's aura into its own blade. Depending on who wielded it, it could be nothing more than a simple piece of iron. In the right hands, however, it would become one of the most powerful weapons in the world, capable of cutting through almost anything. It was one of the 10 heavenly swords. That was exactly why Crash intended to claim it. As he thought about this, he continued provoking Rakuten to keep his attention focused on him. While buying time, Crash concentrated both his ordinary flames and black flames solely on the carriage where Rakuten remained. When the carriage gave way, Rakuten fell out of it, and Crash immediately leaped after him. Now that he was away from the palace's direct influence, perhaps Rakuten could recover part of his own consciousness. And that was exactly what happened. Little by little, Rakuten began showing signs of lucidity again. Crash asked whether he truly wanted to fight in that condition. Rakuten replied that his era was already over, and at least in the end, he wanted to fight as a swordsman rather than as a monster. Because of that, he decided to wager what remained of his life on one final confrontation against Crash. This would not be a battle driven by revenge or hatred, but a worthy duel between two swordsmen. Crash accepted the challenge and assumed his fighting stance. The two charged at the same time, their blades colliding. Rakuten's attacks left behind intensely bright golden trails. That light revealed the determination he had possessed before becoming trapped in that terrible palace. Rakuten was consuming the remainder of his own life force as fuel to keep fighting. His mastery of the sword had reached a level that seemed to completely surpass human limits. Lacradian was deeply impressed upon witnessing that skill. However, she soon realized that Crash had also become far more powerful than before. An astonishing energy radiated from him. Then Crash used Fendel's technique, Flame Erosion, third form, Blazing Thunder. Lacradian was confused when she realized that Crash was using the very ability that had belonged to Fendel. After taking that attack, Rakuten was sent flying far away. For the first time in a very long while, he finally seemed free from the burden of that obligation. Crash realized that by using Lion Air to make the black flame explode from the inside out, he could generate an enormous shockwave. His sword ended up breaking again. However, that hardly mattered, since he was about to obtain another one. Crash then claimed Emoshi for himself. When he summoned it, it formed a blade of aura that was still slightly cracked because it was not at full strength. Even so, he knew that would soon change. The sword settled perfectly into his hand, as though Crash had been wielding it for many years. When Lacradian approached, Crash asked whether she still had the teleportation scroll. Since Rakuten had been defeated, they could leave. As she tore the scroll in half to activate it, Lacradian asked about the lightning Crash had used earlier. Crash explained without hiding anything. It was an ability he had obtained from Fendel, and then he asked whether Lacradian hated him for it. She replied that she did not. On the contrary, she believed Fendel would also be satisfied that he had managed to fight alongside Crash. Besides, for the goal Crash carried, that power would be necessary. Lacradian then asked whether he still remembered the favor she had said she wanted to request. Once she completed the conquest of Maisie Palace that she had promised Fendel, she intended to become Crash's knight. Crash, however, replied that he had no intention of taking an executive position within the Valheim family. Lacradian explained that she had only found her own path of the sword after meeting him. Because of that, she wanted to be useful to Crash in any way she could. He replied that someday she would surpass both master and apprentice levels. Thinking about the future, any help would be welcome. After that, the two returned to the main plaza in front of the tower where Bianca Herdenhorst and the other members of Lacradian's team were already waiting for them. A few days later, someone visited the Blue Pine Mansion to personally meet the youngest member of the Valheim family. It was Rionizer Stalin, the first prince of Stalin. Rionizer was deeply interested in Crash, who had become an important piece in the struggle for power between the factions of the Empire and the kingdoms, as well as a presence capable of shaking Horror Academy itself. Before another group won him over, the prince needed to bring him under his influence. At the center of the Imperial faction stood the third princess, Sigra Mafania, renowned for her extraordinary beauty and talent with the sword. She was steadily gathering more power within the academy. In opposition, the four great kingdoms tried to unite around the sword saint, Charlotte Valheim. However, she was far too independent, had no desire to lead anyone, and simply did whatever she wanted. Rionizer had even tried to control her through a marriage proposal, but Charlotte refused without hesitation, creating resentment between the two. He knew that the academy gathered extraordinary young talents under the age of 20. If the Empire dominated that environment, many of them would be lost. Without the age restriction, Rionizer himself would have enrolled. Since that was impossible, Rionizer needed someone to confront the Empire in his place. For that reason, he headed toward the reception room, where he would finally meet Crash Valheim. As they drank tea, Rionizer reflected that Crash was only 14 years old. Even so, after so many recent battles, the boy seemed considerably more mature than his age suggested. Rionizer apologized for taking up part of his schedule, explaining that he simply needed to personally meet such a rising star. Crash replied that since he had been summoned directly by the first prince, he would naturally make room in his schedule. The prince already knew that Crash had defeated Rakuten. After all, the achievements of the Valheim family also benefited Stalin. He then decided to test him, saying that he hoped to see him continue contributing to the kingdom. Crash replied that he certainly would, Your Highness, and that he would continue devoting his efforts to the Reanizer realized that he had deliberately mentioned Stalin instead of the Valheim family, but Crash showed no significant reaction. Perhaps he had no attachment to his family after being treated as useless for so long. Maybe he even harbored resentment and a desire for revenge. Reanizer could exploit that. The prince also commented that the power struggle within the academy was becoming increasingly intense, and that the person currently at the center of the four great kingdoms was Charlotte, Crash's sister. As he probably already knew, despite her impressive strength, she lacked the temperament to lead a group and was definitely unsuited to being a faction leader. Crash had already understood the prince's intention and directly asked whether he wanted him to enter the academy and take over the leadership. The leadership of the four great kingdoms, confronting the imperial faction, while Stalin would provide him with support. Reanizer replied that it was still too early to promise official support from Stalin because he remained only a prince, not the king. Crash then asked what things would be like a year from now. Surprised, Reanizer wanted to know whether that prediction came from an analysis by the Valheim family. Crash replied that it did not. Since he did not maintain a close relationship with his family, it was merely his personal opinion. Reanizer began to grow suspicious. His succession to the throne would become virtually certain the following year, but that was an absolute secret known to only a very small number of vassals. He wondered how Crash had discovered it. Perhaps the Valheim family had deliberately allowed him to know, or perhaps they truly knew even the royal family's secrets as a demonstration of their power. Reanizer even considered that the Valheim family might have deliberately branded Crash as useless, using the boy as bait to attract people interested in him. Anyone who tried to exploit Crash would end up offering information, resources, and support to help him grow. In that way, the boy could function as a valuable intelligence channel for the Valheim family. Crash immediately realized that the prince was reaching increasingly exaggerated conclusions. Reanizer was extremely intelligent, although he had not yet reached Sisley's level. Before the regression, he had protected the kingdom from the Empire mainly through his cunning. That was precisely why Crash wanted to ally himself with him. Brilliant people often relied on very little information to construct complex conclusions on their own, and they would hardly suspect that a 14-year-old boy could carry memories from a previous life. Crash assured the first prince that as long as the Valheim family remained established in Stalin, they would never turn against the kingdom. Reanizer then asked what he thought of his proposal. Crash replied that they could proceed down that path, but first they needed to spread a certain rumor. The story would claim that the murderous hound of hardened hearts had already been gravely wounded by the Imperial army. They would also say that the Mezi Palace challenge had been resolved by someone at master level together with the subjugation squad, while Crash continued to be regarded as a failure. Reanizer observed that the truth would eventually come out. Crash replied that the royal family only needed to suppress it for a while, as long as the Valheim family showed no signs of suspicion. Reanizer calculated that the disguise would last, at most, 1 year. That would coincide perfectly with Crash entering the academy and the hidden facts being revealed. When that happened, every kingdom as well as the empire would focus their attention on him, trying to draw him into their respective factions. In that situation, Reanizer would naturally end up occupying a central position. The prince had intended to carefully raise him under the family's protection, but realized that Crash was like a tiger hiding its fangs and willing to take his own risks. Since the conversation had gone this far, Reanizer wanted to know Crash's true strength. He replied that no one inside the academy could defeat him. Reanizer found his confidence similar to Charlotte's, although it came from a different foundation. He said that he might need to reconsider his view of the Valheim family and found the conversation extremely interesting. Crash asked whether he was really leaving already and invited him to stay and share a meal. Reanizer declined, explaining that the beginning was crucial when spreading rumors. Since he still had an enormous amount of work ahead of him, he needed to leave immediately. After the prince left, Crash sat down, visibly uneasy. The mental strain was already beginning to weigh on him. Garden had listened to the entire conversation while hiding inside a drawer and, in the end, remarked that it had been quite boring. Crash explained that his dark lunar physique made walking beneath the sun uncomfortable. He wanted to reach the forbidden region through Saphira. The flaming erosion was not a problem, but his world corruption power was still insufficient. Garden replied that it would not be possible. Saphira had already spent too much energy dealing with the Spirit King and, for the time being, could not be used. Besides, Crash needed to act discreetly, since he had promised the first prince that he would not draw attention. Then he remembered another possibility. Valheim would probably send an expedition to the forbidden region around that time, allowing him to infiltrate the Night Order. Krim, however, remarked that this plan did not exactly fit with the idea of remaining discreet. Crash replied that the vice commander of the Knights answered directly to the main bloodline. Besides, he still had a useful resource. It was Darlene's transformation potion. A little of it was still left over from last time. Once again, he assumed Cled's disguise instead of appearing as Crash. Bianca Herdenhortz also disguised herself, merely changing her hair color and pretending to be Cled Cled's sister. Garden remarked that even with magic altering her hair, he could not understand how anyone could look at the two of them and conclude they were siblings. Crash recalled that as soon as the first prince departed, he headed straight for the headquarters of the Azuri Knight Order, the Fifth Sword of Val. With the vice commander's support, he managed to get assigned to the 6th Squad without any difficulty. Before heading to the Forbidden Region, they spent several surprisingly peaceful days within the Knight Order. Now, however, the mobilization had finally begun. The expedition's destination would be the Forbidden Region itself. In 2 days, everyone would depart for the Demon Kingdom. Normally, the carriage journey would take about a month, which was unfeasible given the current situation. Saphira, which was responsible for investigating corruption, would apparently provide a special magic circle. Cled wondered whether Garden had anything to do with it. In addition, the 2nd and 4th Swords would also be sent on the mission. Bianca Herdenhortz wanted to know whether the members of the 2nd and 4th Swords were really that strong. Crash confirmed it. The order they belonged to was the 5th Sword, composed of knights ranging from novice masters to high-level experts. Even so, their strength already far surpassed that of most people. The Green Order, the 4th Sword, consisted entirely of high-level experts. The Crimson Order, the 2nd Sword, was composed of novice masters and several intermediate masters, under the command of Lilith Valheim, Crash's half-sister. Thinking about it, Crash found the situation rather peculiar. Valheim truly gathered an astonishing number of powerful individuals. In his previous life, Rai Valheim ranked among the 10 strongest and had mastered the ultimate secrets of a master. Balrog Valheim, Crash's father, ranked among the top 4. That was why many called the Valheim bloodline a divine blessing. Crash, however, did not see it that way. To save that world, he needed to surpass even the limits of his own bloodline, just as Arthur had managed to do. A week later, they were already settled in the joint camp of the knights near the Demon Kingdom. While waiting for the arrival of the 2nd Sword and Saphira, Crash realized that even before his regression, he had no memory of ever speaking with his sister Lily. She had always been a reserved woman who spoke little and carried out her missions in silence. When she appeared with an imposing bearing as commander of the Crimson Knight Order, Crash also remembered that she was Belican's full sister and Crab's half-sister. She had a quiet and disciplined personality, completely different from her full sister, Charlotte. As soon as she arrived, however, she fixed a firm gaze directly on Crash. Then she walked over to him and handed Bianca Herdenhortz a piece of candy. Crash had never imagined she was so fond of children. She even gave a faint smile. She seemed to like children so much that she made a point of carrying sweets with her. Then she walked away with her knights without saying another word. Crash had not expected to discover this side of her. For a moment, he even considered asking the vice commander to reveal his true identity. Soon afterward, the person who appeared through the summoning magic circle was Saryang Saphira, the princess and only direct descendant of the Saphira family. Beside her was also Blath, Saphira's faithful dog. Crash knew this could happen, but now he was in trouble. The Saphira read the stars to predict world corruption and protect humanity, gathering talented people from various countries into a specialized investigation team. Saryang was the family's only direct descendant, and also one of the candidates for the position of the next first-class officer. She stared at Cled, slowly approached him, and spoke in a low voice, almost whispering beside his ear. She wanted to understand how he could possess so many different abilities. Crash immediately realized that the situation had become very bad for him. He had already heard rumors that Saphira's astrology existed on a level impossible for ordinary people to comprehend. It seemed she could see through everything he was hiding. At this point, there was no longer much room to retreat. Faced with this, he told Saryang that the two of them needed to have a private conversation. Later, they were both inside Saryang's tent, surrounded by the aura of a relic. She assured him that nothing from their conversation could leak outside. Crash explained that he possessed one ability capable of stealing things from others and another that could consume anything in flames. At that moment, those were the only two he could reveal. To prove his claim, he demonstrated his stealing power by taking the object she was holding. After taking the object from her hand, Crash told Saryang that he had a proposal that could benefit her as well. The matter involved the Heavenly Massacre Star. Blavey, the dog beside her, harbored deep resentment toward the world and suffered from the curse tied to that star's power. In the past, when Blavey was still known as the Stellar Celestial Hound, he used Saphira's power to avoid the effects of that constellation's curse. After managing to keep the curse under control, he abandoned his former title and began living as Saphira's faithful dog. Saryang replied that Blav's true identity as a hound should be unknown to anyone outside Saphira's inner circle. Although the disappearance of the Massacre Star would free Blav, it would not benefit Saphira. If it vanished, they would lose the means they used to keep him under control. Crash asked whether she was truly that wary, considering how loyal Blav seemed. After all, Saphira had already made her own decision. Under those conditions, Saryang saw insufficient benefit to consider the proposed exchange. Crash then asked her to use her ability to see the truth and confirm what he was about to reveal. He stated that 2 years from now, in the Garden of Saphira on the shores of Lake Ulfid, he would save Saryang from a fatal fate. Naturally, everyone found it difficult to believe. Blav, however, confirmed his words. What Crash had said was true. Saryang already found it very strange that the boy possessed 3 abilities. What intrigued her most was that she could not identify them. Perhaps they were powers related to theft, fire, and even prophecy. He possessed no ability capable of preventing Blav from seeing the truth. Because of that, she was intrigued when she heard that she would die 2 years from now. Crash then asked whether that was already enough reason for them to make a deal. Siriang replied that she needed some time to think it over. However, Crash made it clear that he had no intention of waiting very long. After he left the tent, Kryn remarked that Crash was also after the Star of Massacre. Carrying it within his own body would grant tremendous power, but it would also come with extremely high risks. Crash explained that he had set that goal aside due to a lack of contact. Now, however, the perfect opportunity had appeared. If he stole that curse, he might even be able to prevent the war against the world corruptors. Kryn was surprised to hear about a war. Crash explained that only a direct descendant of Saphira could sustain the Star of Massacre, but Shriang would eventually be killed by the corruptors. After that, Blav lost control and attacked countless people in pursuit of revenge, triggering a massive war. Kryn admitted that, thinking about it, such an outcome was easy to imagine. After analyzing the facts, Crash realized that Arthur had probably chosen not to interfere on purpose. He took advantage of Siriang's death, Blav's attack, and the war against the corruptors to seize the Academy, the Empire, and all its power. Everything ultimately fell into his hands, but then something unexpected appeared. Crash became a variable beyond Arthur's calculations. Since there is no single solution to prevent the destruction, he will follow his own path. To achieve that goal, he needs to become even stronger and seize everything within his reach. That way, he intends to make full use of every one of his abilities. Crash then told Kryn that he would become far more powerful, eliminating any threat that appeared in his path. He intends to reach a level where nothing can stop him anymore. In this way, he will prevent this world from reaching the tragic future that was foretold. And that's all for today, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Leave a like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and check out the Members Club and Discord where we also post the names of the works. Take care and see you next time.